Welcome to the 2022 Nobel Prize Teacher Summit Hubs. My name is Isak Pettersson. I work as a teacher here at the museum, and I'm here to introduce the Hubs to you. The Hubs format for the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit is based on local engagement, where schools, universities, science centers, and Swedish embassies around the world invite teachers to watch the recorded version of the summit and together discuss and reflect upon the theme. We'll return to the Hubs in a second, but first, come with me. When Nobel laureates share their life stories or are asked about their inspirations, there's that one thing they always return to. The importance of that one teacher who inspired them, challenged them, or motivated them. One such example can be found in the human rights advocate Malala Yousafzai, whose advocacy for girls' right to education has grown into an international movement. At the age of 17, Malala became the youngest ever recipient of a Nobel Prize when she was awarded the 2014 Peace Prize, sharing it with Kailash Satyarthi. When Nobel laureates come and visit us here in Stockholm and to receive their prizes, we ask them to donate an object, something that has meant something for them in their work. I'm standing here now in the gallery at the museum, surrounded by such objects. 1 year prior to her Nobel Prize in 2013, Malala Yousafzai famously addressed the full UN Assembly in New York. Her first public speech after having been shot in the head by the Taliban. In her memorable speech, she demanded action on behalf of the 57 million children in the world deprived of education. When Malala visited us here at the museum later on, she kindly gifted us the pink shawl she wore when delivering her famous UN speech. And it is for certain one of the dearest objects we have on display here at the museum. In her Nobel lecture, Malala Yousafzai directed a special thank you to the teachers who had inspired her, helped her be brave, and believe in herself. And like Malala Yousafzai, we are convinced here at the museum that teachers are a force to be reckoned with. If we are to bring about change, the unique position of teachers is where it all starts. Earlier this fall, we hosted our annual Nobel Prize Teacher Summit at Münchenbryggeriet here in Stockholm. Over 350 teachers from some 30 countries gathered for a full day, listening to and meeting with Nobel Prize laureates, journalists, experts, scientists, and fellow teacher colleagues. The theme this year is sustainability. Humanity is facing an unprecedented challenge. We have the facts, we know we have to act, but how? In a constantly changing world, finding sustainable ways of living is crucial. Our hope is that you are now joined together, a group of teachers, to watch a few segments from the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit and together discuss the theme. The lectures and interviews are 15 to 25 minutes long, and it's easy to choose the segments that interest you the most. If you haven't found it already, all the material is available on the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit website, as is the workbook. So, good luck. We hope that you will find the material inspiring and that it will spark some really interesting discussions. Finally, remember, without excellent teachers, no future Nobel laureates.
Good morning, everyone. I must say, there were more people last year, but I saw no one because it was all digital, and this is so much nicer. Welcome to Stockholm. Welcome to the 2022 Nobel Prize Summit. Teachers Summit. Pablo Neruda, the famous Chilean novelist and poem and Nobel Prize laureate in literature 1971, once wrote, "I need the ocean because it teaches me." And today, we still need, and more than ever, we need the ocean to teach us. We need the forests to teach us. We need predators and pollinators to teach us. And what they will teach us is that we are, as humanity, in the process of disconnecting the Earth's life support systems, our own life support systems. For a very long time, we did that unknowingly. Today, we can't say that anymore. We know what we're doing as humanity. And that knowledge is increasing and growing upon us, not only as a theoretical concept, but as something we're witnessing day by day, year by year. So we need that knowledge to spread. We need to teach more people based on that knowledge. And we need to inspire action on the basis of that knowledge. And this is why teachers are probably more important to humanity at this stage than at any stage previously. And that is why the theme of this year's Nobel Prize Teacher Summit is of high importance. If you ask Nobel laureates, and you'll meet a couple of them later today, many of them will say that their curiosity, their ambition, their inspiration to seek truth and to seek knowledge started with their favorite teacher. So that is in itself a good reason why, to us, it is so important to engage with teachers. It is so important to gather teachers, to inspire teachers and get inspired by teachers like so many Nobel laureates. I wish you a great day today with lots of learnings, lots of inspiration, and ultimately leaving here with lots of hope that we can all be teachers for change. Thank you.
We are so immensely thrilled to see you here all today. At our annual Nobel Prize Teacher Summit, we have discussed burning hot questions for several years now, together with you, teachers, Nobel Prize laureates, and other experts. The focus will be on this planet that we call ours, the strong and magnificent Earth, yet fragile and perishable. And while we will discuss sustainable ways of living, we will recognize many angles that we have touched upon in previous summits: equality, social justice, scientific method, and climate change. Because if we are to talk about sustainability, we need to think cross-disciplinary, and we need to do this in this interlaced, complex matter. Now, that can be a bit tricky. Many of us really prefer one answer and one solution, one kind of recipe. But we have noticed, us working with the Nobel Prize, that Nobel Prize laureates, as well as teachers, are not that keen on simplified solutions. Perhaps it's logical. If you, on a daily basis, are seeking and communicating knowledge, trying your best to help students to become critical thinkers, complexity and diversity come naturally. So in other words, you are, as teachers, way ahead of many of us. You present the remarkable world to children and young adults and point out how it all is intertwined, not only as organisms in the present, but also intellectually, with the past and with the future. So, in other words, look upon this day as a celebration to you. My name is Karin, and together with my fantastic colleagues, and very tall colleagues, Isak, Gustav, and Pontus, and also Paulina and Anna. Where are you? Can you wave? Yeah, there's Anna, and Paulina is over there. there. We will do our very best to guide you through this day. And Anna, you broke your foot, so Pontus will take your place on stage today. Pontus, we work together at the museum, but you have worked many years before that as a teacher. And I've noticed that you really like graphical models.
Well,
why?
Well, I do love graphs and models, Karen, because models, they teach us about our surroundings and our world. And models are used to describe where we're at and where we're heading. And there are many models to be used, but I will show you one that I specifically like, this one. Look at this tiny little dot. It represents the 7.7 billion people living on our planet today. And if you look at this circle, this is the people that have lived and died during the past 50,000 years, approximately 100 billion people. But what if we look at the next coming 50,000 years? Then these two circles are far outweighed by the approximately almost 7 trillion people. These are our grandchildren, our grandchildren's grandchildren, families and friends. When you look at it this way, it makes it obvious that we need to change our way of living and take action. It's almost like we have to see this in another way. It's almost unempathetic of us. It's like humankind have colonized the future.
Yeah, indeed. And Gustav, we will meet. We will meet. Sorry, we will meet two Nobel Prize laureates here today, and we will look at an interview with another two. Are there more Nobel Prizes related to the theme today, sustainability, than those?
Yeah, in one way, I mean, the whole prize is related to sustainability and also to, well, the model disappeared, but to the model of, I mean, Nobel actually looked to the future because the people receiving the prize weren't alive when he lived. But I think, speaking of models, one of the most important prizes was just last year when the prize for climate models received the physics prize. There are previous prizes for work on climate that has received the Peace Prize, and that is, of course, important. But it was actually quite an important statement that the physics prize for climate, that it was a physics and a science prize, because the fact that the climate is changing isn't politics. That's a fact, and then politics can use it. But you know, we have to have the facts first. Yeah.
Thank you. Isak, what do you think we can expect from today?
Well, Karen, I think we have a fantastic lineup here today, I dare say that. And it's clear also, if you look at the program, there's a distinct diversity among our topics today. We have, for example, Stockholm International Water Institute, here to talk about water governance and water resources, to our kids' climate, here to answer the question, how do we talk to our children about the climate crisis? And also, most of our speakers today, they're not teachers or educators. Some are, but most of them aren't. And we've asked them all to make it relevant for educators and teachers particularly. And having glanced at their presentations, most of them at least, it really looks promising in this regard.
Something specific you look forward to?
Something particular? I'd go with the behavioral aspect, probably. You know, how do we think about climate change? Why do we think about climate change the way we do? And possibly, what are some ways we can sway or affect people's way of thinking about climate change and then acting upon that? Yeah. So something along those lines, yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Isak, Gustav, and Pontus. Well, it's time for us to introduce our first guest. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first guest. And that is human rights lawyer, CEO at the Academy for Human Rights in Business, and the chair of Amnesty International in Sweden. Please, a warm hand to Parul Sharma. It's a long walk. There you go.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
I'll give you some water.
Thank you.
So in many ways and at many platforms, you have worked with sustainability, but your professional roots are actually in law.
That's right.
What pulled you into what you're doing now?
Well, I think it was a by default process, to be very honest. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, first of all. It was a default process because when you work practically with human rights, you immediately realize that you cannot address the discipline or work with the discipline in the real world without realizing that it is strongly interlinked to climate justice, to other climate-related affairs, to environmental affairs, labor standards, anti-corruption. So, and I just named the sort of prominent legs of sustainable development. So I ended up working with all these legs, basically.
Yeah. We just had an election in Sweden, and listening to the debates prior to it, they kind of gave you the idea that everything is isolated. I mean, you have education over there, and then you have some melting ices, and then you have energy over there. But it's all intertwined, isn't it?
Very much. You said it in your introduction very rightly. Sustainable development is a cross-dimensional topic. And if anyone sort of doesn't understand it, he or she is on the wrong track, I would say. Very much so. Because we normally talk about excessive consumption, for instance. Now there's a great deal of research showing that excessive consumption is linked to our mental health affairs and our mental health status. Or we normally talk about human behavior, that this is causing, whatever crisis we are looking at. But I prefer to talk about human behavior and human habits, because I believe that if we mix social sciences and natural sciences in a way where we interlink human behavior and human mental health with our consumption behavior, then only we will find solutions. So that's only one example, for instance. We also have good data showing that consumption is actually, in the various research studies, I know of 6 research studies from the Americas and from the European continent, which clearly shows that 80% of our consumption is based on a want-based approach, and only 20% is based on a need-based approach. So whatever we are consuming is strongly related to something we are wanting, and that in turn is regarded in these 6 different studies as any addiction, which is regarded as an addiction today. So I think if we address it from the point of view of an addiction, consumption that is, we will immediately see that this interlinkage becomes life-saving and also life-important.
But it's hard to change your behavior. And I'm thinking of the intertwining part. If you have all these different perspectives and aspects and fields that we need to work on, do you need to start at a specific place, or we need to do this at one time?
Well, I think since we have educators and teachers here today, I don't know how many, but I realized that I thought it would be the majority of the audience would be teachers, but I believe all of us are educators somewhere, in whatever role we have. I do think that it's high time that we address human well-being in order to address the most acute climate change matters. So for any educator or any school teacher or university teacher, my recommendation is start with human well-being, because you can't come closer in relevance to the human mindset than addressing the human well-being. And as I said, if 80% is very much want-based consumption, that means that in turn is related to some sort of an addiction. I think, it can't be more sort of relevant or close to any member of any sort of society which is suffering from overconsumption, which the sort of Western world is. We know that we are where we are because of the overconsumption of the Western world.
But having the roots that you have in law, I'm thinking of, because I think that most of us are aware of that a cheap, T-shirt comes at a very high price for other people, and we still buy it. We don't resist the sale.
Which goes also for the expensive T-shirt.
Yeah.
It's the same. It's the same logic there.
Okay, just say the T-shirt.
The T-shirt.
Yeah. Should we then, since human behavior is, well, of course we can change. I truly believe that, but we are moving slowly. Should we legislate more?
Legislation is coming. For a very long time, we have been addressing corporation as, being a big part of the problem. We have asked corporations to be a part of the solutions instead of the problem. The crux in that is that for a very long time, it has been based on voluntary initiatives. But now, by the end of this year, hopefully, we will see more and more European Union countries implementing a legislation on human rights and environment, due diligence when it comes to human rights and environment in company affairs. So that will be a binding law, and hopefully we will see other effects, because the crux of the matter is, if you have voluntary initiatives, you won't have a level playing field as companies. Every company will deal with issues in their own way. And if there are no consequences, then you won't be sort of investing in sustainable development within your company as you should, with the risk of greenwashing, of course. So we are seeing a lot of legislation coming in. But legislation is good. I have been one, not because I am a lawyer, but because I don't believe that voluntary efforts are going to be helpful in the long run, because I think everyone needs a level playing field, and same with the schooling system. But we can come back to that a little later. But so level playing field, legislation, yes. But I do think that the issue of leadership is even more concerning, because the prime question here should be, what kind of leadership do we need in order to, we have set goals, but how do we reach these goals? The leadership we have today within corporations, or political leadership, or you mentioned our Swedish elections now. I can't say that we have the appropriate leadership to reach the goals, even here in Sweden. The main important question for me is, do we have the leadership required for reaching the goals of sustainable development today? And there is, again, a lot of research on that. And what we see through various research is a lack of EQ-based leadership in the area of sustainable development. Empathy was used as a term. Empathy is one portion of the definition of EQ-based leadership. As for now, if you look at the larger conferences on sustainable development, you will rarely see any lecture or any breakout on this particular matter. So for me, legislation is extremely important to sometimes force behavioral change, but leadership, the matter of leadership, is even more crucial for at least the democratic world, because We claim a lot of things, but I'm not sure we are able to produce the leaders we need for this change. And also the leaders who would understand the linkages between social sciences and natural sciences.
Yeah, I think we later this afternoon will hear a little bit more about compassion. Speaking of EQ, you point out, and Gustav said it also earlier, that climate change and human rights as well. That's not politics, but it's surely used in politics.
Absolutely, it's not politics, but politics can be a very crucial tool to guarantee human rights. As unfortunately, as we see today, only 1 out of 5 state governments are able to guarantee human rights for their citizens today. So hence it becomes even more important to raise the issue of human rights within the notion of sustainable development. I said democracy. Democracy and human rights are important fundamentals for us to at all start in the sort of right direction when we discuss sustainable development. Because without democracy, there is actually very little we can do, and we can see it today. Looking at our world affairs, what is going on in Ukraine, and how it is actually affecting the direction of sustainable development, unfortunately. For a very long time, I think in 2015, when Agenda 2030 was set in the UN, and also the Paris Agreement was signed, there was an idea that we might reach the goals even without democratic setups. But I have colleagues who underlined this as a reality, and I was at that time a minority fighting it. But then, looking at what is happening in Ukraine, looking at the worldly affairs which are going on, it is quite clear that those who were sort of claiming that sustainable development goals can be reached without democratic setups are now on our side, luckily. It's very impressive to read what you have done, and there's a lot of titles, but there's one word that kind of pops up even though it's not mentioned, and that's activism. Oh,
yeah. So we have a lot of activists in the Nobel Prize history. We'll meet one later this afternoon, by the way, and I can guess that you've been called an activist in an encouraging way. Then way to go, good, well done, but also in a very diminishing way. Being naive, you don't know what you're talking about, keep dreaming. What are your reflections on this word? Because I can just imagine that there are some students in your classrooms that are passionate and that have an anger and a sense of they want to do something.
Absolutely. For me being... the definition of activist is a person who is a reactionist and asks questions. And for a student, if we try to silence the student's activism, we are actually putting him or her in a great, not only a distress, but also we are making a great disfavor to the planetary challenges we have today. You said that it can also be diminishing. I think here in Sweden, where we are at the moment, many times, and especially when I was younger, I used to get this very often, that it's good to be an activist. That's good, and it sort of it comes with young age. But you have to be pragmatic in the end. So being an activist means that you're not pragmatic, basically. And being interested in pragmatism means that you are sort of pushing away activism, which for me is completely the opposite. I think being an activism is today about being pragmatic and being a problem solver. Yes, I do think that we should also not silence youth when they get angry about things. We need to have And that's why I'm talking about this EQ, emotional quotient leadership, because such leadership would have the ability to actually take care of these qualities as well in a beautiful way, and also store them so that they become a pragmatic force for change in future. Very important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need that.
Yes.
A warm hand to Parul Sharma.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And Isak, do we have any questions from the audience to Parul?
Yes, they've been pouring in left and right. No, they haven't, but we've received a few. And first question, Parul. Sometimes we hear internationally that Sweden does enough when it comes to the environment. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think when it comes to our country, our own territory, we do quite a lot, and still it's not enough. But unfortunately, Sweden has a massive impact on the rest of the world because our consumption-based impact when it comes to emissions, at least in third countries, is extremely high. So there we are still not doing enough, and that's where I spend a lot of my working hours on, making companies realize that whatever sort of CO2 emissions they are having and indulging in through their productions in so-called high-risk countries, they need to take more control of it, and they need to address it and acknowledge it. We are still lacking a great deal of acknowledgement in that area. But yeah, I mean, look outside. We have probably the cleanest air in the world. We respect our territory a lot, but I wouldn't say we do the same with other countries.
Okay, another one. Consumption is currently essential for our economies. So how can we have strong economies without consumption?
I think the question, that's very crucial. That's actually the gist of the matter. If we want to have healthy citizens, I think we need to address this whole economic growth in relation to healthy citizenship as well, because now we do have, as I said, a lot of research showing that the human well-being is actually suffering massively because of the sort of economic direction traditionally we have wished to have in countries. And I also think that we should start reviewing whether GDP actually does anything to human well-being. If you look at the richest countries in the world, the OECD countries, we also see an immense increase in depression amongst our populations. And if you link that depression to the overconsumption, the 80%, which I was referring to, you see a clear linkage there. So I think we should not probably say that with consumption comes economic growth. We should ask, is this economic growth healthy for human well-being? That's the question. Actually, if we are serious and if we are concerned about ourselves and if we love our families and our children, then that's the question we should put.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Time for one more?
One more.
Okay. Some curious teacher here has a question. Was there any teacher that made a lasting impression on you, and why?
Thank you so much for that question. Very much so. I had, in elementary school, few teachers who could see my individual passions in terms of which areas and directions I probably wanted to have. It's hard to say in that age, but they were very open to it, and they spent time and energy on me, which I will always be grateful for. Similarly, in high school, I received great guidance from my teachers, especially because at that time, I'm very old, I know you can't say, but I am. At that time, some 25 years ago, social sciences were not really, and I believe sometimes still that's a problem, were not really a prioritized area. And many times I wanted to pick up law. I didn't know which subjects I should focus on. And again, I got a great deal of attention from some teachers, which has helped me. And I am in touch with them even today. 25 years down the line, I'm in touch with them. And I have thanked each one of them for their support. teacher means the world, and it's the world's most important profession, I would say. And I'm not saying it because I'm sitting here.
But it's good that you're sitting here and saying it. Yes.
It's a privilege to be able to sit here and say it. Absolutely.
Parul Sharma, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So on that note, please welcome our next guest, who, like Parul Sharma, works with policymakers on how to tackle climate changes and human rights crisis. Please welcome climate change and circular economy expert Tim Gore.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. Let me get some water. So my name is Tim, and at the moment I work at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. I'm a researcher looking at climate change, circular economy. Before this, I worked for a long time at Oxfam International, where I also led a lot of work on climate change. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that I started there at Oxfam today. And the subject of the talk is about the inequality which is at the heart of the climate crisis. And I want to start by reiterating a simple but very profound idea. And it's this idea which is at the heart of the injustice of climate change, that those people that are least responsible for causing this problem are worst affected by it. It's a simple idea, but it's so profoundly important that I reiterate it, because I think that it should be at the heart of how we talk about this problem, how we teach about this problem, how we design solutions to this problem. And there are many different ways that we can think about it. There are different illustrations of this injustice. It's inequality in emissions, it's inequality in vulnerability. Perhaps the most intuitive way is to think about it in terms of countries, and we heard a bit from Parul Sharma there about the unequal responsibility amongst global rich countries compared to global poorer countries. So here you have in the top panel a map showing emissions per capita, so total emissions produced in these countries per person of the population. And at the bottom is an indication of vulnerability to climate change. And what we see, of course, in general is that the countries who tend to be more responsible, have higher emissions per capita, tend to have lower vulnerability to the climate crisis, and vice versa. And we get the same pattern if we looked at historic emissions, so all of the emissions that were produced in those countries since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and again we would see a similar pattern. And this is the basis on which the UN climate change negotiations are based, and it's the way that we're often thinking about responsibility for climate change. But it's just one way. Another way, and very relevant to all of you as teachers, is to think about the inequality and responsibility between generations. So young people today, and certainly future generations not yet born, it's very difficult to make the case that they are in any way responsible for this crisis. Some generations in privileged countries perhaps benefit from the emissions of their parents or former generations, but it's very hard to imagine that they're really responsible for it. And yet they are inheriting a world which has got a depleted carbon budget and is an increasingly dangerous climate. So we can think about this inequality in terms of generations. We could also think about it in terms of companies. So by some estimates, there are only around 100 companies that are responsible for the majority of emissions that are in the atmosphere today. And these are the big fossil fuel energy companies who have literally dug up, extracted the fossil fuels and burned it to make energy and selling it. So it's just one way of looking at it. And these companies, these big fossil fuel energy companies, well, there's no way that they are being particularly affected today by the climate crisis. In fact, these are some of the companies that right now, with record energy prices around the world, are making obscene windfall profits. So they don't seem particularly affected by it. They've certainly, you could argue, are responsible for driving the problem. And there are many other ways. We could look at it in terms of gender. It tends to be that men are responsible for a higher share of emissions, tend to be less vulnerable to climate impacts than women. We could look at it in terms of race, many different intersectional forms of inequality. The way that I'm going to talk about today is in terms of the inequality of emissions associated with the consumption of people around the world. And we've heard a lot from Parul just now about the importance of understanding consumption as a driver of the climate crisis. And so the work that we began at Oxfam tried to answer the question, how is the responsibility for emissions associated with consumption shared amongst people with higher incomes and lower incomes around the world? So to do this, we have to first allocate all of the emissions in the world, not to the point where they were produced, but to the point at which the goods or services that were, for which those emissions were produced are consumed. So take an iPhone. If the iPhone is built in China, we don't allocate the emissions for building that iPhone to China. Instead, we allocate them to the point of consumption, to me here in Sweden. And in our work, we wanted to understand in particular a very important period of history. This is the period between 1990 and 2015. It's a really critical 25-year span in understanding the climate crisis. It starts with the publication of the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, IPCC, which was in 1990. One of the Nobel Prize winners, by the way. I think 2007, the IPCC wins the Nobel Prize. So in 1990, the first IPCC report comes out. After this point, arguably, no country, no government, no company can really argue that they are not aware of the very severe risks of accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And at the end of this period, we have the adoption of the Paris Agreement, which sets the goal of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. It's a very interesting period in history. In this 25 years alone, the total size of the global economy approximately doubled. So huge expansion of economic growth around the world. And there were benefits from that because we saw a very rapid reduction in extreme poverty rates around the world. So extreme poverty here meaning around about $1.90 per day. People living at that level falling quite rapidly around the world. This is good news, and most of that was in China. So we did see some real progress. But it's also a period in which economic inequality in most countries around the world rocketed. So the countries in which the majority of people lived in the world in this period saw a big increase in the gap between richer and poorer people. And as a result of that, despite this huge increase in the size of the global economy over this period, at the end of it, about half of the global population was still living on less than $5 or $6 per day, which may not be the extreme poverty line, but by any objective standard is still an indication of pretty dire, desperate poverty. So the best you could say is that the economy has been incredibly inefficient at lifting people out of poverty in this period because of this inequality. But there's another cost as well, because the growth that we saw in this period wasn't just highly unequal, it was also highly carbon intensive. And as a result, in just these 25 years alone, the total amount of emissions added to the atmosphere was the same as all of the emissions that had been added since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So from around 1850 up to 1989, that total amount of emissions added to the atmosphere was added again in just this 25 years. It's a huge acceleration of the climate crisis. This is the period where we really brought ourselves to the brink of catastrophic climate change. And so if we want to figure out what we do next, it's important to understand what went wrong in this period. And the question that we asked ourselves was, well, whose consumption was responsible for driving this massive increase in emissions in this 25 years? And these are some of our headline results. So we organized the global population on the left from the richest 1% of people, which we show in black, down to the poorest 1% of people. And we organized them into these 4 global income groups to make it easier to see the results. The richest 1%, the richest 10%, which is the black plus the gray together, the middle 40%, you can think of this as like the global middle classes, and then the poorest 50% of people on the planet. And in the middle you see the growth in emissions over this time, and the total emissions associated with the consumption of these different global income groups. So the first thing you can see is that the richest 1% of people alone were responsible, their consumption was responsible for approximately 15% of the total emissions added to the planet in this time. And together, as part of the richest 10%, they were responsible for over half of the emissions added to the atmosphere. Meanwhile, the poorest 50% of the global population, their consumption is responsible for less than 10% of all of the emissions added in this time. And on the right-hand side, you see what the cumulative emissions added in this time mean for the depletion of the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So remember that climate change is a problem of cumulative emissions in the atmosphere. There's a total finite budget if we want to keep warming below the 1.5 degrees. And for the consumption of just the richest 10% of people in just 25 years depleted a third of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. The rest, what's left, is being rapidly depleted every year. This is running up to 2015. We've already burned through most of the rest of it in the 5, 6, 7 years since, and we're on track to burn through the rest in the coming years. Here's another way of looking at those stats then. The richest 10% of people on the planet are responsible for approximately the same emissions as the rest of the world combined, and the richest 1% alone are responsible for nearly double the emissions of the poorest 50%. This is the extreme carbon inequality at the heart of the crisis. I'm going to skip that one. This is then the picture today. The green bars here, again, you see the 4 different global income groups at the bottom: richest 1%, richest 10%, middle 40%, and poorest 50%. The green bars represent the total emissions associated with those income groups in 2015. So it's like a proxy for the picture today. And the dots here are representing the per capita emissions in those groups. And the line is the global average per capita emissions that we need to hit in 2030 to have any chance of keeping global heating below 1.5 degrees. So immediately you can see that the per capita emissions of the richest 1% of people on the planet are well in excess, they're about 30 times higher than is needed in 2030. The richest 10% are about 10 times higher, but what is very notable is that the poorest 50% of people on the planet have per capita emissions which are far, far below that level. So there is scope for them to still grow their emissions and remain within a sustainable level, but only if the emissions of the richest people on the planet are substantially, significantly reduced over the next few years. And I think one other thing that's striking here is that, I mean, I've been doing climate change stuff for maybe 15, almost 20 years now, and for most of that time, the big focus of the debate has been here, the middle 40%. Many of these are citizens living in China, in India, in middle-income countries, and everybody is obsessed by their contribution to emissions. What's the point in us doing anything when China builds a coal-fired power station every other day? These kinds of facts that are very present, at least in European and North American political debate. And there's been not enough focus on what is happening here. An equivalent amount of emissions in absolute terms and far, far higher emissions in per capita terms for just the richest people on the planet. So our argument is that we need to see much more focus on what is going on here, this huge overconsumption of the most rich, high-emitting, and powerful people on the planet. Who are these people? Where do they live? Well, this has changed a lot over this period. So at the beginning of this period in 1990, the vast majority of the world's richest 10% of people and the richest 1% of people, they lived in high-income countries, mostly in Europe and in North America. So those are shown by the light green and the turquoise here. But by 2015, this has changed. So by 2015, you still have a lot of the emissions associated with the richest are coming from citizens living in North America and Europe. But now we also see a big share of those emissions coming from citizens in many other countries, notably in China, but in India, in the Middle East. In fact, there are now citizens in this group from all countries all over the world. It's a much more diverse picture. And this is why we think that this is an important additional way of looking at the climate crisis. Because really, this is a crisis driven by rich, high-emitting people wherever they live. And I would argue that rich, high emitters should be treated alike, whether they live in China or India or here in Stockholm or in the US. And similarly, people that are destitute in the United States of America or even here in Europe, they shouldn't be treated in the same way as billionaires in those countries. So we need to think about different income groups and where these people live. And where do their emissions come from? Well, it does depend on which country. There are many different contextual factors, so it's not always the same, but there are a few patterns that we can identify. This is from a different study which looks at the breakdown of emissions associated with consumption of the richest 10% and 1% of emitters, the highest 10% or 1% of emitters here in Europe. And there's a few things that stand out always. Firstly, it's transport. Transport is the biggest, or it's the most unequal form of carbon consumption. It makes up by far the biggest share of emissions of the richest, highest emitters in Europe, but also in many countries around the world. It's having bigger cars, ever bigger cars, by the way. They keep getting bigger and bigger, SUVs especially, and driving them further and driving them faster. But then beyond that, it's about flights. It's taking more flights for holidays. It's taking first-class flights. As you go up the income spectrum, of course, it's even about having private jets and also these mega yachts, which are huge emitters. And of course, we saw last year even the advent of space tourism, like the most extreme, extraordinary example of carbon inequality that we could imagine. But it's not just the direct consumption of these households that matter, it's also their investments. So in general, it's the richest 10% and it's certainly the richest 1% that have savings, that are making investments, and these are overwhelmingly associated with high carbon industries. And there are many other ways in which this group is very important for tackling climate change. They tend to have very high political influence, access to decision makers. They have status as role models for many of us. Think about celebrities with their Instagram accounts of taking flights, private jets, all of that. These are people that are setting the social norms by which our children are being raised. And that's why it's important to think about them and think about how we can change what is happening here at the top of the income spectrum. So some final thoughts, and I hope we'll explore some of these in more depth with all of you in one of the breakout groups later on. What can we do about this extraordinary level of carbon inequality at the heart of the crisis? One thing to think about, I think it's very important for teachers, is about the framings and about the narrative. Never forget this inequality. This isn't a problem caused by all of us as the human race. No, this is a problem which is associated overwhelmingly with a very small minority of the richest, most powerful people on the planet. Let's not forget that. Let's make sure, therefore, that the way that we talk about the crisis always reflects this inequality. Doesn't forget it. Always remembers that this is about an injustice. You know, we keep on talking about it. Those of us that have done work at the UN climate change negotiations, we just keep hammering the same point. We've been saying it for 20, 30 years. We must keep saying it because there must be accountability for those countries and those individuals who are overwhelmingly responsible for the crisis. The other thing I wanted to reflect on is about procedural issues. So whose voices are we hearing in this debate, and whose voices are you reflecting in the classroom? When we think about climate change, we think about the solutions. Are we really just hearing from the same people who are overwhelmingly responsible, the big business leaders, the representatives of the highest emitting, highest income classes? Or are we hearing from the voices of people on the front lines? Are you hearing from those who are most affected, who are least responsible but most affected? Those are the voices that you need to reflect in your classroom. You need to ask, whose solutions are we putting forward? There are many policies that we can think about, and we'll describe some of those more in the breakout sessions later, specific policies that can help to tackle emissions while tackling inequality. But perhaps the biggest thing, and just wrapping up, perhaps the biggest thing, and the point that I think Parul Sharma was making well just before, is that ultimately we need to think about a different type of economic system, one which is less unequal and less carbon intensive, because it's that economic system which has failed us, brought us to the point of climate catastrophe, and if we want to design something different, we need to think in those much bigger terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tim. We will soon have a panel on what competences our students need, but looking at my students in my classroom, I mainly will snatch their credit cards, I guess. Thank you very much. So, Isaac, do we have some questions?
We do, yeah. So, Tim, you can I think this is where you are heading, but one of our teachers is asking, has there been a testing of a carbon tax so far anywhere, or when do you think we will see it launched?
Yeah, so carbon taxes are one of the policies that are often put forward as part of the solution. We have forms of carbon pricing here in Europe for many, many years, with quite some success actually in driving down greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the thing with carbon taxes is that they can be a tool, or a very regressive tool, in that it tends to be that lower income people, although they have much lower emissions, their expenditure on energy tends to be a bigger share of their total income, their total expenditure, than that of higher income households. And so if you just apply a carbon tax on its own and don't do anything else, that can be very regressive. It will hit the poorer people harder relative to their income than higher income people. We obviously don't want that. It will actually exacerbate inequality. But if we take the revenues which are generated from a carbon tax and instead redistribute those back to lower income households, then we have a tool which is both helping to tackle climate change, but also ends up being highly progressive. And it can actually help to tackle inequality at the same time. So these are some of the types of policy solutions that we need to be looking at, we need to be talking about, and I hope we'll explore some of this in the breakout later.
Where are we on time?
We have one question.
Personal question, Tim, from one of the teachers.
Yes.
You work with this daily. How does it affect your way of living? Do you feel guilt when you buy Christmas gifts or go on a vacation?
Yeah, it's a really difficult. It's a really difficult question. For sure, I think some of you may have heard of this concept of flight shame, which has come sort of out of Sweden. And I think that there's one framing here which is about sort of shaming people for this excessive overconsumption. That's one way of sort of approaching it. I don't think in the end it's about making individual people feel guilty for doing the things that perhaps they need to do, going on a holiday once a year with the family and so on. But we do just need to understand this extraordinary inequality. There are certainly some types of luxury carbon consumption associated with the richest people on the planet that probably should be shamed. We don't need to go into space for tourism. We don't really need to drive ever bigger, ever higher emitting cars. We don't really need to take multiple flights every year just to have a business meeting, for example. So there are forms of consumption which we should be looking now to eradicate, to ban, and governments have a role in this, but also social norms need to, and I think are shifting to make some of those types of consumption less socially acceptable, and I think that has to continue.
So, thank you very much, Tim, and you will stay on stage now. Thank you, the audience, for great questions. Thank you. So now it's time for our first panel, and Tim, as I said, you stay on stage, and I will welcome back Parul Sharma, that you already met, and also Shepherd Urenje. Please join me on stage. Warm hand. We'll have to watch so I don't fall off stage. Please.
Thank you.
So, as I said, you met Tim and Parul, but Shepherd Urenje, you are a teacher and a specialist in education for sustainable development at the Swedest in Uppsala University. Warm welcome to you as well. You have listened to Parul and Tim now. What are your reflections so far on their topics, so to speak?
Yes, I was very fascinated by what Parul did bring out to us, that excessive consumption is linked to our mental health, that 80% of the things that we buy as individuals are based on what we want and not what we really need. And because this is a mental health issue, many times we don't know that we are actually addicted and we need help because of that. So that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And also, when I listened to Tim, it was also fascinating to see how the trajectory of carbon emissions is actually very much linked to opulence or richness. That is, see, we often talk about poverty alleviation, but we don't really talk about decreasing opulence, decreasing the excessive riches that we have in the world. And this, I think, is the one that is exacerbating or continues to uplift the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, and yet the least responsible are the most affected.
Yeah, that's truly it's amazing and a bit worrisome, of course. So thank you very much. The panel that the subject for the panel is what competences do our students need, and maybe we can connect to the overconsumption as well during this discussion. But what competence does today's youth need to develop? What do you think, Parul?
Well, I think we've said it a few times, but I think it's extremely important to introduce students to more cross-cutting issues, cross-cultural issues, multidimensional issues, and also pair natural sciences with social sciences. But that is, of course, easier said than done. Looking at a global curriculum, it is not a very open setting in the traditional schooling system.
No.
And I also see that in the schools and colleges where we see this happening, this meeting between social sciences and natural sciences in order to have more innovative solutions for reaching our development goals. I do see that there are certain schools and educational platforms belonging to a certain socio-cultural socio-economic background, sorry.
Yeah.
My fear is here that we might find this kind of a proactive solution building in elitist schools and not really accessible to all segments of societies.
Yeah. So just to elaborate a little bit, can you connect that to what you were talking about, the leadership?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to this is a matter of political realization, isn't it? That I think our politicians need to realize that schools are not equal today, not even in Sweden. We have a lot of unequal schooling going on, and if that equality is not there, then we can't really count on a strong movement in the field of sustainable development.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Tim, what about what do you think about the competence question?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a need for skills in sciences and engineering, for example, the technical skills that we need to build a clean economy, to build the new technologies that will be part of it. But I think, more important than that is this understanding it's not fundamentally an engineering challenge. It's not fundamentally a technical problem. Say, we just need to switch from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable-based energy. And that's kind of how we framed this question
exactly.
for maybe 20 years almost. I think what kids need to know is about the power imbalance at the heart of the crisis. They need to know about this burning injustice. They need to be angry about it, I hope. But the other thing that's, I think, really important for kids, and I've got kids, is that they feel they can do something about it, that they feel empowered to do something, that we also teach them about how to make change happen on this issue and many other issues. What can we learn from the other issues, from the other social justice struggles that kids could bring to this? And, to be honest, I mean, we have all learned from the Fridays for Future movement, from the emergence of this youth-led climate movement. So, those are the lessons that kids need, I think. They need to be empowered to take those types of steps because ultimately, that is how we will shift this injustice. That's how we will change the balance of power that is needed. And then, of course, we need all of those technical skills, the engineering skills, the science skills in order to implement the solutions. But if we don't challenge the unequal power, all of the best scientific and technical knowledge in the world will not be enough.
Okay. A short reply from Parul.
No, I was just thinking about. I mean, I don't wish to be a party pooper here, but if you look at Fridays for Future, who are the ones sort of relating to Fridays for Future and engaging in Fridays for Future? It's a white middle class group of youth, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I think we need to address the inequality even in the environmental movements today. You were talking about the frontline, Tim. Same with the new movements popping up, the youth movements popping up around the world. We don't see youth and children from the indigenous groups, for instance, whereas the UN climate panel is saying that what we need, what mankind need is going back to basics. And who knows going back to basics better than groups who are actually not involved in these various climate and environmental movements. So we need to address this inequality as well. This is not a matter of the middle class whites. It's a matter of the poorest of the poor, and we need to find solutions involving these marginalized groups. And same again, and I love Fridays for Future, and I work with them, and I coach them also. And so they have now a beautiful collaboration with groups like Black Lives Matters and so on, and certain indigenous groups as well, which is very helpful. But and that learning should be taken by everyone, I believe, who are claiming that they're working for a positive change in climate.
Yeah, and can I give the word to you, Shepard, because you're working with the teachers and how to teach about these issues. So can you elaborate a little bit about what Tim and Parul is talking about? How do we do that for the teachers, and what do your expertise say on this issue?
Exactly. You see, the question that should keep most teachers awake is how do we prepare young people for a future that we don't know? We know change is going to happen, but we don't know how that change is going to manifest and what will change. So that future requires a learning teacher, a teacher who is learning all the time. So the competencies that we need to develop here are, I think, first and foremost, are learning competencies. If we haven't been able to solve the challenges that we have right now with the type of learning that exists today, then we need a different way of teaching and learning. And our question is, what kind of teaching and learning is that? That's what we should be interrogating right now. And apart from that, we need social skills that should be attached to the engineering, technical skills that we already have, that we are already teaching. And as a result here, the competencies that a child should have are competencies that should, when we put them into the future, they should be able to swim and become and reach the shore. But what is happening right now, only a few are able to swim, and not everybody is able to swim to the future that we don't know. So the competencies here are very much entrenched in how we teach and how they learn. They really need to learn in a different way. So the critical thinking that we talk about right now is not exactly the same as the critical thinking that we have used all the time. We are looking at critical thinking that interrogates the kind of challenges that we have, anticipating a future challenge, and also being able to deal with uncertainties and things that come without us being prepared for.
Yeah, it's a small task.
It's a very small task indeed. I was also thinking that I do understand that we are discussing what skills do we need to sort of encourage amongst students and pupils, but I think an even more crucial question is to ask, how much has the teachers' training programs changed actually? In line with climate change issues or climate justice issues. My firm have been looking at a few teachers' trainings programs. I'm going to talk about it in the breakout as well.
Yeah.
And 9 out of 10 teachers' training programs have received no change whatsoever to adapt to the climate change or even sustainable development per se. And these correlations which we are underlining here, and the importance of understanding the correlations between social sciences, human behavior, and natural sciences, that's also something which is lacking massively.
I think we all know that the institutions that does this, the universities it's not a rapid change most of the time. So it's a bit of problematic.
Yeah. But it hasn't really yet begun. That's the problem,
that's
even the discussion.
Yeah. So I will have one last question. These teachers are going back to the classroom on Monday. Where do they begin? What should they start with? I mean, we don't have access to the new teacher training program that doesn't really exist, as you say. Well, Tim, what do you think? Could you give them a hand?
You know, the other, I think it was mentioned at the beginning, right at the beginning of today, that, you know, this isn't a crisis any longer about the future. This is now. And actually, we were saying that, you know, in Oxfam and others in the movement, you know, 15 years ago. So it's been now for a long time, but it's ever more present. It's ever more visible on our TV screens, in our daily lives, in all parts of the world. And I guess, you know, maybe one thing is just to reflect on that every time it happens, because one danger is that extreme weather events, disasters, they become just normalized, the new normal. Oh, well, we're all going to get used to the fact that we're living in a more unstable climate. And then the risk is that we forget that core injustice. Why? Why is this happening? It's not natural. This is man-made, and it wasn't made by us as the human race. It was made by a specific economic model which benefited overwhelmingly a very small minority of very rich, mostly white, mostly living in the global north people. And so perhaps something that teachers could do is every time there is a new extreme weather event, and they're only going to keep coming every day, every week, in every part of the world, perhaps just taking a moment to reflect on that. Who is suffering here? What are the solutions that we need? Whose voices are we hearing around this? I think one thing that's very notable for me that with the recent awful flooding in Pakistan, which is not the first time we've seen such flooding in Pakistan, but is possibly the first time that the links being made, even by Pakistani government and many other commentators, is so clearly about the climate crisis and about pointing the finger and saying, look, this has been caused by someone else. What's going to happen? Where are the reparations? Where is the support? So I think the more reflection that there can be, you know, from a young age on those questions about where responsibility lies and how to design just solutions, the better our chances of actually making something different in the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you. Shepard.
I will go back to where I started. I would like the teacher to concentrate on how we can teach and learn for the future, for a future that we don't know. This begins with creating a learning-centered environment, which is different from a learner-centered environment, in which case we are saying create an environment where everyone in that room is a learner, the student, the teacher, and anyone who happens to be in that environment is a learner. That is the first thing that I would suggest here. The second thing that I would suggest is try something different. I don't know what it is, but just try something different from what you have always been doing. Change is uncomfortable. If you are still comfortable with the way you are teaching in your class, you are probably not changing. You are not being innovative. You are not being creative. Creativity and innovation is uncomfortable. Try something different. That's my advice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Parul.
I often get this question from teachers out and about. And my response is, firstly, do a health check in your management in the school. Is your top management with you? Because if you're going to do something different, and in my view, different when we talk about sustainable development is to understand these cogwheel processes again, and these cross-cutting seminars and labs. The schools and the institutes who have been good at it have actually done a health check in the top management to see whether your dean is up to it, whether top management is up to. You need mandate, basically. One teacher can't really take as many initiatives as we actually need to one, indulge our students in hope and efficiency and give them tools. But so for me, the topmost priority should be check your top management. Are they competent enough in these issues? Are they ready to change? And are they ready to give you mandate to do something different, basically?
That's, I think, three very good, short, at least in the context, short, good things to do on Monday. And I will give you a warm hand, and I hope you'll enjoy it as
Thank
well.
you.
We are now going to meet two laureates in economic sciences, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. And we're standing here at the Nobel Prize Museum next to the clothes that they wore at the Nobel Prize banquet. They have devoted their careers to fight poverty, And they do this by securing that policymakers get the right and relevant information.
It's very nice to meet you, and thank you both for participating in this Nobel Prize Teacher Summit that we arrange annually. And most of the questions that I'm going to ask comes from teachers all around the world. And since this film will be shown in a room filled with teachers, I must start quoting you, Professor Duflo, in what you wrote for the Nobel Prize site about your upbringing. You said, "I was not stellar at anything in particular, but very organized, quite solid in every school subject, and generally keen to please." And you must have been a dream student.
I think I was an easy student, yes. Not trying to make any waves, very diligent, happy to talk to teachers and to participate, but not too loud. I think you wanted me in a classroom, frankly.
Yeah, I can imagine. Were you the same, Professor Banerjee, or did you behave this well?
I was not particularly ill-behaved, but I was not particularly involved with the school. I really disliked the school. I thought it was an extraordinarily unpleasant sort of climate to be in. It was kind of hostile and violent, and I really abhorred the entire enterprise. And so for me, I just mostly checked out. It's fine when I'm really upset. That's often my reaction, is to fully check out, and I was mostly checked out.
That's interesting. I mean, it can obviously differ, your experiences from school, but you, Professor Duflo, you also said that you noticed early on that not everyone was an A student, and you thought early on how to spot a talent, how to spot a passion, that everyone had something. How could you kind of make something out of that in school? Why were you convinced of this so early on?
I think it's a theory that I made for myself, because I could see that people in school, but in general in life, had very, very different success paths. And some people seem to, have a chance to contribute so much more to classroom discussion or to society and so on. And at the same time, I was very against and very morally offended by the idea that you might despise people or judge them negatively and all that. And so I really had this tension of how can you justify different success in life and the fact that everybody is worth it. So I kind of formed this theory that everybody has a talent. So everybody is really equally good. But then since there are so many potential talents, you may or may not find yourself in a position where you can actually experience your talent. So you take, for example, a child in my class in France, like maybe their specific talent is chess, and nobody ever proposed them to know chess. They might never know that they would have been a fantastic chess player. Or I remember reading about a tennis player who starts playing tennis at 3, and I thought maybe I would be a fantastic tennis player if someone had put a racket in my hand when I was 3. I now realize that it is not the case. That's not.
No, you never had that experiment. You started at 40, so you didn't have that chance.
I didn't want this experiment, but I'm pretty convinced that it would have been disappointing. And so in general, that sort of formed the theory of the world that was like that, which is everyone has this talent, and then sometime you're lucky to be in the right place at the right time, and these talents get rewarded, and sometimes not. So everyone is ex ante equally fantastic, but then not everyone gets to realize how fantastic they are. And so this was a way for me to reconcile my, it's more like ease my psychological tension, and but at the same time, and be able, in a sense, to respect everybody while being aware that there are different rate of success and contribution.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from, and to some extent, it's still with me, or to a large extent, it's still with me, because when you work on poverty, you realize so many such instances where people are born in situations where, because of their poverty, the set of their options is limited. You know, someone might be extraordinarily good at school stuff, but they are placed in a bad school where nobody will ever realize it. Someone may have a great business idea, but nobody will lend them money, and so on. So a lot of our field is about that, really. And but this is something that was formed in my head more as a kind of a way of surviving in the world that is, you know, unfair, in a sense.
Yeah. And speaking of your field, you received the prize in economic sciences in 2019 for your experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. That is the prize motivation. Could you tell us a little bit about this experimental approach? What does it mean?
Go ahead.
No, I think you can go ahead.
So what it means is that we don't take as given that because we are wise women and men and we have thought about it, what we propose as solutions to social problems are necessarily right. That there's an important step which goes beyond our intuition and our knowledge of economics or of social sciences and our general wisdom, and that's just the empirical verification of it. Does it work? And lots of things that are kind of presumed to be right don't work. And actually some things where we were told by experts that this is not of any interest, it has no chance of working, do work. So both ways we are often wrong. So the sort of philosophy behind what we do is that you need to eventually subject it to a test, not every time, but once or twice or thrice, so that you are convinced that the intuition you started with, or the organization that was doing it, or the government or whoever was doing it, the intuition they started with is actually subjected to a rigorous test. And the way we do the rigorous test is by kind of following the protocols that were developed in medicine, which is to randomly choose a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group gets the new program, and the control group gets the old, the existing program, and then you compare and you choose them randomly so that they are, to all intents and purposes, identical. And therefore, if you see that the treatment group has outcomes which are very different from the control group, then you're convinced that either it was good or bad, or depending on the direction of that difference. And that's what a randomized control trial does, and that's what we use. Those are kind of, they are experiments. There's experiments in the social sciences, and those experiments are important for fighting poverty because of what I said before, which is that we often get it wrong in both directions, actually.
Thank you. And closely related to that, a question from a teacher. Are there good, robust ways that teachers, without the know-how you possess, can still effectively trial and evaluate different teaching methods in their own classrooms? Have you seen or heard of any such examples? Or do you have any thoughts on possibilities and barriers here?
Good question. Esther, go ahead.
That's a great question. So it depends what you call. There are experiments and experiments. So certainly teachers can be at forefront of experimenting in the sort of classical notion of trying out new things. And you can try a new thing as a teacher, either brand new that you just developed on the basis of your experience, what you may have read somewhere, but that is something that nobody's ever tried. Or you can experiment with new methods that have already been evaluated by others but are new for your own classroom. And both are, in a sense, the kind of more common language notion of experiment, which is moving out of your standard operating procedures. And that everybody can do, and I should argue everybody should do, because we can constantly make progress and see what works what seems to work and well in a particular classroom. For the experiment, in the sense that we conduct them, what is really key is reasonably large samples. So you want to compare what is done in maybe 100 classrooms to what is done in other 100 classrooms. So any teachers is always only like one of those. And obviously, it's usually pretty difficult to treat different children differently inside a given classrooms, because they interact so much. So it's pretty rare that you would conduct a within classroom experiment. And a teacher alone cannot on their own create a across classroom experiments. On the other hand, there are many opportunities to participate in such work, to be one of the classes. There are also now more opportunities to participate in educational experiments that are done online, which are kind of formative experiments to try out new methods, new curriculum, etc. So, for example, MIT has a platform called Lookit, where you can kind of be a site for something where you might have teachers who are involved in from many other countries, who are doing things with their children, either a group of children or some individual children, and are kind of part of a larger process. So there are now ways to kind of embed yourself in larger experimental collaborative projects that might be exciting.
Thank you. The last question, surely not the least one. When it comes to fighting global poverty, what would be your #1 advice to teachers?
I guess I'll start and I'll let Esther have the last word. So my #1 advice would be to be honest about what they are seeing. So while I agree with what Esther said, which is that you can't do a formal experiment, but you're always learning. You're always observing that this child is reacting well to this and that child is not. And I think part of the reason why my school experience was so negative in this particular school I went to in India was that I think the teachers were essentially reacting to the failure of students by blaming the student rather than themselves, and hitting the students or whatever. They were really quite violent in the way they dealt with it. They were blaming the student. And I think the first order fact is that when you fail, you need to be honest. When you fail, when a child fails, you fail. And when you fail, you need to be honest with yourself to ask, why is it that this child, and I'm with Esther in believing that every child can learn, and why is this child not doing what I expect of him? And I think asking that question with a great deal of honesty is the first order obligation of every teacher. I'm a teacher, I also fail. And when I fail, I try to ask myself, what did I do wrong? Here, it's not because the student doesn't have what it takes. It's because I did something not right in this case, and sometimes it's just bad luck, but often it's the case that it's really a matter of opening your eyes and noticing what you didn't do right.
Thank you. Do you wish to add something, Professor Duflo?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit where the teacher is. If we think of global poverty as in poverty in the poorest countries, some of the teachers who are listening to us might be in poor countries themselves. Then they have a direct responsibility towards their students to do everything Abhijit talked about. And I have nothing to say here. I completely subscribe to this. And then there are also teachers in the rich countries. They also have to behave like that with their students. And I'm sure the people who are listening to us have such inclinations. But they have one more responsibility towards the global poor, toward children, the poor children all around the world, which is to make their children, their students aware of what it is to be poor. Growing up in rich countries, I know for a fact that we got very little exposure to what is happening in the rest of the world, and I got some more because of my parents and my family. But even the one I got was very caricatural and inaccurate in many ways. So I think teachers can take time in their classroom to introduce material and share some things about the condition in which the children live in the poor countries. So I've done a small path in this direction, which is to write a series of children's book, which is designed to the small kids aged about 5 to 7 to be read by a teacher or by a parent. Currently they are in French, but eventually they'll be English and maybe, who knows, Swedish version. I don't know if they're any good, but that was really the ambition, is to say, look, children can learn anything. Children are still very open. They are not yet deformed by all the stereotypes that they'll be exposed to later. So this is a wonderful time to make them aware of, the extent to which children in poor countries have problems that are different from theirs, but also that have problems that are very similar in some ways, and to create a community of purpose among human beings. And it might be one of the biggest things that teachers in a richer country can do to help global poverty.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your reflections. You also wrote at the Nobel Prize site, Professor Duflo, to place that you want to play some role in helping others get the opportunity to find and nurture their talents, and you both surely do so, and I think that many teachers can relate to that on a daily basis. Thank you so much for participating. It was an honor to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, two very different experiences from their school time, I would say. We'll talk some more about what's happening in our schools now, and to join me on stage, I welcome 3 teachers who is participating in the conference today. So please join me on stage. I will introduce you as you go up here. So give them a warm hand, please. So we'll have Petra Nygård. She's a school leader and a teacher from Sweden. And we have Reid, teacher from Boston.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, sorry, USA. And we have Emeliana Németh, from a school leader and a teacher from the Philippines. So
thank you.
Welcome.
I'm working in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. Indonesia. Okay. So first of all, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on how you work with sustainable development issues in your classroom. So, Emeliana, maybe you can start.
All right, thank you. So I just would like to say thank you all for this opportunity to be heard in front of this great audience. So perspective from Asia, thank you. But I think before I answer that question, I'd like the audience to understand where I'm coming from. I work in a school in Indonesia. It's an international school, and we've got 6 campuses all over the archipelago. And we are following the Cambridge curriculum. And if you know about it, you know that we are deeply involved in making sure that the students understand the subject in a deep manner. So the idea is to make sure they are learning, and it's a lot for them. So the question is now, how am I going to insert all this sustainability thing that's, being bombarded to us? We have our leaders coming to us and say, what's hit right now? Climate change, sustainability. Put it in your lesson plan. Done. And then I'm also a teacher. I'm not just a school leader, so I know the idea of what time, where am I going to put it? So I thought of a way, and instead of just complaining, I thought, you know what? You're a teacher. You should be a problem solver. So what I did was to make sure that all my lesson plans are aligned to the framework of the school. And one of our framework is actually STEAM education. And with STEAM, there's collaboration between subjects. And I actually, well, not me, I think it also solved the idea of there's too much projects for students, one project per subject. And the parents are complaining. So what we did was, okay, let's do the STEAM project. And it's a collaboration for all of the teachers. There's one project, and everybody can chip in, and the students can get a grade from that one subject alone. And my school, luckily, is also working with the United Nations and responds to the climate change number 13 of the sustainability goals. What we did was to come up with projects that actually respond to what is happening in Indonesia. Let's say, for example, housing that's in poor condition. So we work with Habitat for Humanity, for instance. And then we also thought about the energy crisis. And right now, actually, aside from Indonesia, I also have 9 students who's working with the Japanese government. It is a collaboration. It is called the Motainai, if you're familiar with that. It is about, well, they say it's water waste. So these students are trying to solve energy crisis, water pollution, air pollution, and in a way that they can do it in a classroom level. So a lot of things has been not really solved, but in a way there is the starting off. We need to kick off. I think I'll end my answer to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So Barbara, can you elaborate a little?
Okay. So I teach in a coastal community in New Hampshire that's already seeing the impact of climate change. And one of the classes I teach is environmental science, and I have colleagues that are also working in the sciences. And we all pretty much commit to doing project-based learning where we involve the expertise of other people in our community. So those people come in and collaborate with us, share data. Our students collect data for them and put that into the shared data sets. And so in particular, for an example, one activity that I do is my students collaborate with the climate scientists at University of New Hampshire, the Regional Planning Commission, and an architect who focuses in sustainable design. And they read the climate impact report for the region, and they use that information to identify those areas that are most impacted, what the nature of that impact is, and then they design structures that are going to be economical, sustainably sourced, and climate resilient. And they finish the projects, and they invite the rest of the school in to explain what they've done and why it's important. So that's just one example. My colleagues have multiple other examples.
Thank you very much. So Petra.
Yes. Well, I'm fortunate enough to work at an IB World School in Västerås. And what's going on in our classrooms is so many things, but the our mission is actually building global citizens for a better world. So it's already built into what we do, and we walk the talk every day. It doesn't always look like that, but sustainability is what we work towards. And we work transdisciplinary, and I was really happy to hear the previous speakers talk about how important it is to, for instance, connect social studies to integrated sciences, because we believe that to solve the problems of tomorrow, we're going to have to look in other fields, in other areas, in transdisciplinary units. We won't be able to solve the problems. But what we also, just to give you an example, in the beginning of this year, the students built sustainable houses. So we brought in the real world, an architect, an expert in this field, to actually guide our students in how to build it. And it was our teachers in maths, design, and arts created this fabulous project, very hands-on and very like a real-life experience. But we also have something called service in action. So right now, our students are litter pickers. They clean the forest from litter, and they recycle and upcycle with what they find. So trying to just not to view litter in a different way, but all of this is already built into the IB. But I have 25 years of the Swedish curriculum, so and it was actually the Swedish curriculum was written to work transdisciplinary, but it didn't really work out that way, unfortunately.
No, sometimes we can experience that in our schools here in Sweden.
Yeah.
So it seems like aligning management and also work with local issues is something that you all talk about. What are the benefits, you think, to work in this way that you all actually described? Barbara.
I think that it becomes highly relevant to the students. It involves the greater community in the education system. And I think that the students feel very empowered to take action because it is in their community that they're seeing this impact. It's just an overwhelmingly powerful experience for them and very engaging.
Okay, thank you.
So continuing on that, also I'd like to add that the students we're catering for are middle class to upper class. And earlier, Mr. Gore mentioned about, kind of having a talk with those in the 1%. And I thought this is a way for me to actually tell them what's really happening, because the students I'm working with, they do not go to slums, they're not going to understand what's happening right there. They see it on telly, but that's it. So I thought if I actually kind of work with them, because they are going to be the future of that city. They will be the business people. They're going to be the leaders. So making them understand that there is this need and you have to act now, not because we are ticking boxes, the school is, we're doing climate change, but actually to make sure you are empathetic. You are going to be working with real people in the future. And I want you to be good leaders and citizens of this place that you live in.
Thank you very much. Petra, short last reflection.
Well, a reflection is that we need to change the politics because that's where it's stuck. We need to look at teacher training. Teachers need to be able to be teachers, and given the time to work on these tasks, it's not going to work any other way because it is the most important job.
Thank you all. A warm hand to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you can stay just a little bit. Let's continue with all the other teachers in the room, all of you. So we will have a short discussion around the table, and I would like you to talk about how do you work with sustainability today. You can share, think about it a little bit, and then share with your neighbors what you work with. And I will go around and listen to you. Thank you very much.
So our next guest is the 2019 Nobel Laureate in Physics. And if I'm correct, the third person in history to discover a new planet. That's quite something, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you discovered well the first exoplanet. Looking for new planets. Is this? Did you do this to escape Earth, or?
Well, not really. No, it's just a curiosity-driven. I think we have the solar system, and it was very, natural to ask whether there are other planets on other stars. And the fascinating aspect of that is it took a long time. I mean, this concept was kind of widely accepted 100 years ago, but never demonstrated. And some people started to doubt about it. And we started the game, and we have had a lot of surprise since then.
What have the biggest surprises been?
Well, the biggest surprise is we were looking for systems similar to our own planetary systems. And so far, we have found plenty of planets. Essentially, all the stars have planets. But they look slightly different. For example, the first one we found was similar to our giant planet, Jupiter. But instead of being orbiting very far away from the sun, the planet was so close. The orbit would take a bit more than 4 days. It means the temperature on the surface of the planet was above 1,000 degrees. And that is what we call now the hot Jupiters. And we have kept discovering planets so awkward. We call that super Earth. You may have heard about that, or mini Neptunes. And for us, the astrophysical community, and that was a shock, because we had a pretty good understanding of the way the solar system would be formed, and we have to rethink the whole theory. And if you want to get a little bit of a grasp of the mental twist that we had to go through, I think we experienced a similar idea that at the time of the Copernicus revolutions, when you have to reset the Earth at the right locations. So we reset the solar system this time at the right location, which is just one amongst many, with many planets being quite different. So we're back to the question, is this exactly how unique we are? And fortunately, as often in science, we don't have yet completely the answer to this question, and that's the reason why there's a lot of people working on that right now. This is why you have a beautiful telescope called the James Webb Space Telescope, and plenty more under construction.
So, but the theme today is the Teacher Summit is One Earth, but you said there are super Earths. Are there many planets like Earth, and does this give us hope? Can we go to these planets again?
Well, yeah. Well, I think this concept of traveling out of the planet, from my perspective, looks a bit silly for the reason that, well, we have to realize how difficult it is to escape for the gravity. I mean, we see this amazing rocketry, expertise that we have developed in the last 50 years, but it's still a tremendous amount of energy to just lift up the gravity on the Earth. So it's really difficult to get out of the Earth due to the gravity. Now, this being said, the other big issue we have here is life as we know it on Earth, which is a single entity, actually. And just something which worth remembering, that there is no much difference between a grass or flower and us. I think we build with the same ingredients. Life is one recipe that has developed and multiply and explore all the possibilities, all the niche that you can imagine, and is everywhere on the planet, and not only on it, it's also in the air, it's also down. And this life is fitted to our planet in a sense that it developed, it adjusted, it's called the fitness principle, to grow and to flourish on that planet. So if you take life on this planet and bring it somewhere else, I take Mars because it's quite common these days to think that way, that's it, is death. There is nothing else but death going to Mars. We're not at all ready to go there. We're not ready to survive there. It's like being in a location where nothing is fitted to us. So you may have to think maybe developing a new species, which is not anymore us. And it may happen in the future that we're going to develop a new species and we are going to go on Mars. But right now, I think it's completely silly to imagine we go somewhere else. Speaking about the other stars, then the practicality is just the distance. It's a bit difficult to capture how far are the stars. But there is a very simple way to do. If you take a good sunglasses, you can look at the sun, right? You keep your sunglasses, you go at night, and you look at the stars. You get a feeling how far they are because they have the same brightness. So it's really, really far. And I think going to other stars is just a dream. It's really a dream. It is very close to the physics limit, where it's almost impossible to go there, and we know we can't really travel fast. There is a limit to the speed of light that is impossible to reach because the mass grows infinitely at that time. So the energy you need to travel to that speed is infinite. So we really have a big challenge. It's not like flying over the Atlantic, because actually flying over the Atlantic 1,000 years ago was a crazy idea, but you could see seagulls doing that. So as some animals were able to do it. So physically you have ways to do that. Well, you don't fly to other stars. You do something which is really extravagant, and I think the idea to leave this Earth is ridiculous.
Yeah, so, okay, well, good to know.
Sorry, we have no option.
I have some tickets here to rearrange. No, but so the reason for looking at this planet then is, of course, not to escape, but I guess we can learn about our own planet by looking at other worlds.
Yeah, well, it's always the same. I think the purpose of developing new knowledge is hopefully to learn something in terms of curiosities as well, but also to use it for our own goods. And we've done that pretty well so far. I mean, think about, the progress made, on the society, on the way we just live longer and we live better, we eat better, we travel better. There's a lot of things we do much better, much easier. We connect much better to the other people on this planet. So there is really all this knowledge base that has been established is being used for that. You all have a cell phone, and cell phone is one of the good examples of how many Nobel Prize laureates, made a discovery that is making the cell phone possible. So all this is built up on the society. And in one way, the society of today is entirely built on the technology. The technology is driving the society, whether we like it or not. I know some people jumping the seat, they say, oh, no, this is not the technology, this is us deciding what to do. Actually, no, you don't, because you adapted to the technology. You travel by car because you thought about the car, because there are cars. You're using a cell phone to communicate, not because you thought about the cell phone, because they are the cell phone, and you're using it because it's practical. So we tend to adjust to what is available, and we will adjust with new idea. So when you're talking about the universe, it's difficult to understand what is the connection with what we're doing on Earth, but there are plenty, because to see this difficult other worlds, we need to develop a brand new series of technologies, ideas, and techniques. And along that way, there is a lot of small inventions which is being made. You don't realize this, but in the lab, we keep inventing stuff to solve a problem. The Wi-Fi, which you have here in this room, the Wi-Fi is born by the radio astronomers because they needed to connect the telescopes together. They had no interest about using that for the society. They just wanted to connect the telescope together. And they developed the technology, and then it went off into the society. So it's one of the many, many examples I can give you there. So there is really this return of the knowledge. Though there is a much more profound return, is how far this is impacting on our society. And that is difficult to gauge, because it may depend a lot of the sociology that we have inherited. It depends a lot of our education, depends a lot of the country we're living. Some of the countries, they just don't care because they have much bigger issue to deal with. Food problem, teaching problem, education problem. Other, they can use that and try to think about what are the consequences. It's more difficult to get it, but there are consequences. And some people keep mentioning that the American Revolution, for example, is one of the results of the Newton law of nature. Newton, by creating the law of nature, invented a new concept, which is completely revolutionary at that time, because it was the law of gods, not the law of nature. And Newton is a believer, is a very strong believer into gods. Most of the production he's making is about God. It's not about physics or mathematics. But he came up with this idea that there must be some kind of a law of nature. And this law of nature went into the society to challenge the law of gods and the reason for monarchy. And that was one of the reasons why it's quite often quoted that American Revolution kick-started. The argument has been used and used again to say, well, if there is law of nature, why should we have a king then, and so on. So it's very subtle to find the impact, but knowledge have an impact. And today we have to acknowledge that even science have maybe too many impact, too much, because the society is essentially established on the science. And maybe we should reflect on that and think how better we can connect the scientific knowledge which has plenty of limitations, with the reality of the society and the psychology of our species. And that is really a big agenda, I think, beyond this conversation.
Yeah, what does that say about the responsibilities of scientists? If your ideas and applications sort of transform society, what is your responsibility?
Well, this is the difficult question, so thank you for asking it. It is difficult to understand what you will be doing with the new knowledge. It's extremely difficult. Take the Einstein relativistic equations. When Einstein developed the equation, it's for the beauty of the aesthetic between the time and the space, and he wants to connect the two, and he's developed these equations. Well, these equations are crucial and being used for the GPS, which unfortunately is being used by all the weaponry to target people. So, you know, it's difficult to connect the two. Of course, there will be always the use which bring death to anything you do, because this brings you more power. And the most extreme case is by understanding the nature of the sun. We are developing new medicine, all this machinery we have. You can go to scanner right now, we can do all that, which is fantastic. It's saving millions of lives. But at the same time, this made the thermonuclear weapon as well. And this is one of these bigger threats for society, or civilization, certainly, in the near future. So this tension always existed, and it's from the very ancient. I mean, look at Archimedes. Archimedes was developing new concept of hydrology, but at the same time, he invented some way to send fire on other ships. It always been there. So we have this tension in our species. That is much beyond the knowledge. It's related to our own psychology and the society, the education of our society. And unfortunately, I don't think we can do anything. I mean, practically, when you build up the knowledge on that, but there may be a lot that we can do later on. And why don't we ban all these thermonuclear weaponry? I think it's not a physical problem. It's not a scientific problem. Just a political problem, that we have a difficulty to deal with the concept of war. What is the concept of war practically for society? And that's not physics. We're talking about sociology and psychology here. And that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, but this is an interesting tension. We started with, you said that science is curiosity-driven. And curiosity is a very playful and good emotion, but it also turns into this, it can turn into this dark consequences. So you have to be sort of curious and maybe a bit childish almost, but you can't be naive about your work. Is that a tension, do you think?
Well, I mean, the concept of naive is related to a philosophy of life. You have something maybe see naive in one way, in one part of on the earth, and not at all, because depending of your reference level you're using. So naive is difficult because it's a moral statement you have on what people are doing. No, I think the curiosity is embedded into our species. This is how we learn. If you want to learn something, this is what the child are using to learn, is the fact they are attracted to new things. So we have this attraction to new things, and any of us have this. Some people keep developing that at a very high level. I mean, all the scientists keeps to maintain this kind of awareness of curiosity, to be curious about anything. And I can tell you I'm curious about anything, not only about physics. It's really where we are, and we should be, in a way, all of us. And then what we can do with that. But there's nothing we can do. It's our own nature. So we have this, I think it's a gift. It's really a gift that is helping our brain to function. The curiosity makes our brain functioning. I mean, this awful test that was done 50 years ago when you left, a newborn child without any stimulations, they would die. So I think it can tell you a lot of the story about the impact of the curiosity. And we know that when you get an elderly, you have to maintain some level of awareness of curiosity to keep your brain functioning. Otherwise, you will decrease and much faster. So we have to be curious. There is no way out. We're born with this curiosity. Now, the way we use the knowledge, it's a completely another story, and that's something which is related to the education and to the social norms. And I think we have a lot of work if you think about our Earth as a global entity. But we are coming from very far. I mean, you think about 1,000 years ago, I think we've made a lot of progress since then. So why not being a little bit optimistic here?
Yeah, good message. Isaac, there, do you have any questions?
I do, yes.
From our teachers.
Pretty difficult, perhaps, but
oh my God.
You're a scientist. Would you say it's a moral obligation for scientists that they must take part in the debate and be advocate for the research?
Oh, advocate for further research?
No, to engage in political debate
Oh, okay. So I think to me, I don't see any dividing line. I tend to break dividing line. I don't like dividing line. I think this goes against progress and against exchanges. I think science cannot decouple from the society. It's part of the society. And you see the science being done reflecting into the society and the mood of the society. They're all going together. So what may be missing, maybe it's some natural channel to have the two talking together. And I think this is a problem of education. When you think about high-level education, people going to university or high-level of academies later on, they don't have very often the opportunity to cross fields together. And there is a couple of new initiatives right now, people trying to develop that concept. It's called the more flattened concept. And we will have to, because a lot of the very complex problems that we will have to face in the future, I just dump one of the very classic ones, which is global warming. I mean, global warming is not a scientific problem. It's a solved problem for science. I mean, it's a solved problem since 50 years. It's not a scientific problem. I think the first clear theory of prediction from the 80s on this, and it comes early on from a Swedish physicist that described the impact of CO2 100 years ago. So I think the problem of global warming is it is connecting the scientific knowledge, the technology to deal with that. There's a lot of technology tricks you can do, and you can use it to fix a problem or to decrease a problem. There is a society impact, the reaction from the society, which is the psychology of the society to it. And then there is the impact on the economy, and the impact on the economy having an impact on food and the way which people make a living. So you see the problem cannot be solved by one category of people. You need to have people that have at least the curiosity to connect with this other field. And the way I think the education has been operating in the past, we used to joke about that now in the academia. We used to say we tend to stick too much to the Victorian age of the science, where you divide into blocks, and the blocks have difficulty to talk together. And I can tell you, it's not the lack of interest from each of these people. So all these people, when you talk to them, they're very, very happy and they're very curious and they want to understand what's going on. But the structure, the funding structure, the structure of the academia tend to resist to that because it's a controlling mechanism. It's easier to control people when they are into boxes than when there is no box anymore. So I think this is a challenge for the future of education, is how can we educate the future generation of pupils and students, the old teachers, so I think you have a clear role into this, to embrace while keeping the focus on something you're very interested, because you need to focus when you do your study on something, keeping your eyes wide open, and maybe have in the curriculum opportunity to have a bit of extra stuff, which is not exactly connected. I know some institutions are developing that, but it's far not well developed at this point. So I think this is a challenge, this is where we have to go. So it will naturally come, because people that have this education level and awareness will naturally engage, and I really believe to the bottom-up approach here. It's just let the people talking and establish what they need, that trying to fix something for the top. It never works.
Good stuff. Time for one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
one more.
For a bit of a forward question here, perhaps, but the stereotype of a Nobel Prize laureate is that of an absent-minded genius. Are you an absent-minded genius?
Well, you should talk to my wife, I think. I don't know. I think, you know, first, well, we have to understand that Nobel Prize is the tip of the iceberg of a lot of high-quality researchers doing fantastic work. And the fact there is only one Nobel Prize a year in much of the category is very limiting in the number of people that would deserve the Nobel Prize. So for one Nobel laureate, you have at least 100 times more scientists that would be absolutely qualified to have the Nobel Prize. It's just because of the way the system works. And you become a bit advocated for the others when you do that. As first this being said. Now, if I see my colleagues the way we are, I think we're just very curious and very seriously engaged into what we're doing. And by the nature of the work we're doing, I mean, with genius in a sense, we're doing maybe something a little bit beyond the horizon of knowledge, but it applies for any science. What you get a Nobel Prize, what happens is people is expecting you to talk outside your field of competencies, which is interesting with some limit. when you want to develop a bit more cross over boundary knowledge, exactly what I was talking about. So for me, it's an asset because I can talk to my colleagues, chemists or biochemists, and about origin of life, for example, which is one of my topic of research. And it's much better when you have a Nobel Prize because they tend to listen to you a bit better. But aside this, it's just an entry ticket. What you say matters at the end. So you can open the door. If you keep telling them it's rubbish, I mean, that's it. And you just miss the point.
So if I ask your wife, she would say curious, not absent-minded.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of joke in the family about I forgot to switch off the light, I forgot this, I don't know where are my keys and stuff. This is becomes a kind of a pattern. So I accept it. So.
Time for a short one, Gustav. Short question. Are we?
No, we have a red light overtime. So
red light.
So we've become absent-minded and went overtime. So, but of course, we can listen to you later as well. Thank you so much for.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So, from one physicist to another. Yes. Yeah. Please, a warm hand to Maria Gunther. You are a physicist, but you are also a very well-known journalist here in Sweden. You are science editor at Dagens Nyheter, which is the largest daily newspaper here in Sweden. I mean, as a journalist, you are used to reflect on other people's thoughts and remarks. Any thoughts so far?
Well, I must say it's been a really great morning. I mean, I have to first, when I came in here this morning, I realized that the last time I was here was in September 2013, when the IPCC presented their 5th assessment report in this room. And then I had just had this job for 1 month. So I have this job now for 9 years, but it started with covering climate change in this room. So it's great to be here. And it's also great to be in a room full of teachers, because as a science journalist in Sweden, I'm fortunate enough to get to talk to almost all the Nobel laureates. And I always ask them about their inspiration, and every single one has told me about a teacher or a few teachers. That has been really important for their career and for their life. So that's great to be here. And and there has been the speeches have been great. I mean, to look at consumption as an addiction, it was really thought-provoking, and it's very great way to. Something I have to write about, I think. And and also Tim Gore's speech about the inequalities of emissions. That's also something that you will read about in Dagens Nyheter in the future, I guess, because that's, but we never forget this inequality. It's very striking inequality between the rich and the poor. Yeah. Well, I can go on forever. The talk then about to empower students to do something, the real importance of teaching this to our children and teaching about inequality, and also Esther Duflo, that everybody has a talent. And I also, Banerjee, when he talked about failure, that the failure of a student is the failure of a teacher. Well, it's also true for journalists. I mean, if people don't understand, if the readers don't misunderstand something I've written, I can blame the teacher, but it's my failure. I mean, if I cannot write as well as so the people understand what I mean.
That's an attitude that could be useful for us all to
yes.
have.
Yeah.
I mean, as a chief editor, you don't write about divorces and spicy scandals directly. No. You write about and you report on science. Can be spicy as well, but not in the same way. But my guess is that this is a bit hard in the sense. I mean, when it comes to climate change, for example, and when you write about it, there is not one single disaster with a drama to it. It is an ongoing process where you actually use the superlatives once, twice. Is it hard to get the attention
yes.
in the long run?
Yes, it's really hard. I mean, is contradicting to everything that's, for a journalist, I mean, you have to something that's new and unexpected. Climate change is not new, it's not unexpected. We have known it for a long time. It goes on, and and we can write crisis and crisis, but you have to. Well, we like to use superlatives as journalists, but when we use them all the time, people stop listening. So it's really hard to do it and to not become an activist, but to tell people what is happening and to make people realize what's going on. It's not easy.
No, I think Tim Gore was into that also when he said that we normalize if there is a flood, well, there's another flood, and it just gets our daily news. Yeah. You recently wrote an article about the statement that more people die of cold than of heat.
Yes.
And you meant that this is an example of what is sometimes called a red herring, which I think is an absolutely fascinating expression. A kind of, if I understand that expression correctly, a kind of deliberate mislead.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this article and what was the fuss?
Yes, it was because of we just had a general election, and this statement kept coming up in the debates. I got it in emails, and people say, well, climate change is no big deal because more people die of cold than from heat. And that's a very juicy bone for any journalist, a statement like that. I mean, can we debunk it, or is it true? And so we go off and we try to measure, is this true? Do more people die of cold than of heat? And well, it's complicated, but in some way it might be true because more people die after days that are unusually cold than after days that are unusually hot. But it's, if you look at the global statistics. Yeah. But also, the heat kills instantly. When there's a cold days, the deaths start coming after 10 or 20 days. So you don't know if it's a cold or if it's a virus or if that the people are indoors more. So it can be the cold, it can be other things, but that is not important. The important thing that the statements have distracted us from what important questions. What are you going to do about climate change? And what are our missions? Because now we're starting to, because even if the temperature rises, we don't know if less people will die from cold, because we don't, when we start to discuss this problem, we stop discussing the important problem.
Yeah, you call it an insidious debate technique.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if the best response to a statement like that is that, well, what do you mean? Do you mean that climate change is good? Should we increase our emissions? Is that what you mean? You can use that in the debate, because I don't think they would say that, but they just distracted us from the important.
And all these distractions, as you mentioned, how can teachers help students to navigate in this jungle of both then scientifically proved facts and pure opinions? I mean, because, well, the truth is often diverse and it's complex and can be very wordy, and a random opinion can be really catchy and you know, it's easy to fix, and who can resist a good conspiracy theory? So how do you navigate in all this?
Yes, the problem with conspiracy theories is that they're almost impossible to contradict, because the fact that you are trying to contradict the conspiracy theory is part of the conspiracy theory. Then you're hiding the fact. So it's really hard to counter a conspiracy theory. But well, there are 5 things that you can aspects that you can use to spot flawed argumentation. Well, the first is the identification of there is a conspiracy behind it. That's the second thing is the use of fake experts. I mean, if there is people, you can always find someone who agrees with the view that more carbon emissions would be good for the environment, but that's not in agreement with what the majority of the scientists say. So, and the third characteristic is cherry picking. I mean, the selectivity. You only use the results that agree with your theory. And the fourth is creation of impossible expectations of what the science can deliver. Like, say, I get emails saying, but you don't know about the temperatures 500 years ago. No, I don't know exactly, because there were no thermometers then. I mean, and we didn't have thermometers thousands of years ago, but we have other ways to measure temperature back then. But they are never good enough for the climate skeptics. And the fifth is the logical fallacies. I mean, like completely wrong argumentations, or like, well, I wrote an article this week about creationism, and I'd like to compare a watch. A watch is made by a watchmaker. If a watch is made by a watchmaker, then the universe has to be made by a watchmaker too. I mean, that's not really a
it's stretching it a bit.
Stretching it a bit.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Last year, 2 journalists received the Nobel Peace Prize. Dmitry Muratov from Russia, chief editor of the Novaya Gazeta, and Maria Ressa from the Philippines, who's founded and writes at of the site Rappler. And they both work for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And freedom of press is for sure not something given in this world. Can we even start a journey towards sustainability if we don't have this freedom of press and freedom of speech?
No, of course. As a journalist, I cannot say yes to that question. Of course, we need freedom of speech for democratic society. Yes.
But the Reporters Without Borders states in the World Press Freedom Index from this year that we are in a new era of polarization, amplified by information chaos. I mean, as a science editor, can you recognize this information chaos when it comes to your fields?
Yes, definitely. And there are so many, like this statement of the more people die of cold than of heat. I get this all the time. Different interest groups try to distract us from and try to divert our attention and try to have an agenda so that we will not spot what's really going on.
Yeah. Can you sense that science is more than before used politically today?
Well, I think so. I think that science might always have been used politically in some ways, but it's certainly the impression I have, especially. Climate. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, climate change wasn't a political question. Then, Margaret Thatcher believed in climate change, and George Bush believed in climate change. But now it has become that only the liberal it's been if you're not a liberal politician, you don't believe in climate change, and that's so it definitely becomes more political.
We've been talking a bit about what teachers can do, how to move ahead with the challenges that we have. What about journalism? What would you say you need to do within your profession? Do you need to moderate something, or are you on the right track? And I'm speaking about the free press.
Yeah, if you're on the right track, I hope we are. We try to stay on the right track, but we always have to question ourselves every day if we are doing the right thing in the right way, and always have to. Well, there's a lot of thinking going on now after the election in Sweden, when the question of climate change was completely lost in the debate, and it was not important. It should have been the most important question for us all, and I think the press and media is very much to blame there. So we always have to question ourselves.
Yeah, we must all. Yeah. Thank you so much, Maria, Gunther. A warm hand. I hope you had a great lunch and enjoyed some company. And we will continue this afternoon with ongoing amazing guests. And, we'll start right away with Gustav. Who are you sitting next to?
Yeah, I am sitting next to Espen Stoknes, who is a psychologist and economist, and who has written a book called What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. So I guess my first question has got to be, what do we think about when we try not to think about global warming?
Well, we think about sex, of course.
Okay, oh.
Don't we? But not just, of course, not all the time, but I guess a lot of you work with youth, so a little bit more. We think about my latest quarrel with my partner, or we have a fear of what I'm going to say to my boss tomorrow, or maybe who I'm going to party with on Friday.
Okay.
Tonight.
Yeah.
These kind of things. So they are near, personal, and more emotional.
Yeah, so we think about things that are fun to think about. Is that
not necessarily fun. A lot of people have
important.
Obsessive compulsive thoughts, keep going on. So
but things are close to us. So it's the problem with climate that it's not close to us.
That's the main issue with climate. Even the word climate change. Did you ever see the climate?
No, I see weather sometime, but climate is a bit more abstract. Okay?
Yeah, you can't see climate.
Okay. I can see curves sometimes on the
yeah,
it's scary.
Abstract curves, and then you hear about strange things such as ppms.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere.
But parts per millions doesn't seem very serious. Per million, parts per hundreds would be worse, I guess.
We have other numbers as well. For instance, how much does the ocean rise in centimeters per 10 years?
In centimeters,
I guess you thought a lot about that, yes?
No, and I also think centimeters maybe not be a problem, right?
And we have even words, crazy numbers, such as global surface average temperature change per century.
Okay.
Did you ever see that animal?
No, I haven't. But again, it seems like it's easier. I would rather think about something else because this is, well, a bit per century is also, it's not about tonight.
And what about CO2? Did anybody of you see CO2? No.
Sometimes in the water, but this is still.
Oh yeah, sometimes in my cola. Yeah, right. I've never thought about that. That's cool. So if CO2 was a brown gas that was a little bit more heavy than the air, then all the CO2 would slide down, and we would be walking around in a brown fog, thick fog of CO2 that would be about 5 meters high, and then you die.
Okay, so that would be something we couldn't ignore, I guess.
Yeah,
well, we would die. So
it used to be like 3 meters. Now it's 5 meters. So we almost doubled it.
Oh, that's a big change. So I guess what you're saying with these examples is that some words are hard, but the images are easy. Or is that what you're after?
I want to be realistic about the human brain. How it works. Scientists are not, and a lot of teachers are not very realistic either. Scientists tend to think that people, in general, humans, are like themselves. So they have training in logic, in number and facts and causal thinking, and they try to avoid irrationality and stick to rationality. And then they use this as a guiding line when you want to communicate climate change. And then the idea is that if only I could get these facts into the heads of the people out there, the people of Stockholm and the people of Sweden and the people of those voters, then when the facts are clear, when they understand what ppms are and what global surface average temperature changes and etc., then they would change their mind, and then they would change their behavior, and then society would start to shift. So the idea is that the brain is like an empty bucket. I call it the bucket theory of climate change. So if this is empty, what you need is facts and data. And then when people fill up, they will agree with IPCC.
Okay.
But the problem is that this glass is already full. So my brain is already up here. And what happens if I pour a lot of water now, more facts in here?
Well, it will spill over, I assume.
Don't know if I would, so this is the challenge with climate change communications, that we believe it's called the information deficit approach. So, there's climate science. climate science does research on the heat balance of the Earth and the composition of gases and the forcings per square meters and all those things, and it's very good science. On the other hand, we have this thing now which is called climate psychology, or the science of science communication, because you start to do research on what actually works and what does not work when it comes to science communication. So the strange thing is that these facts that I try to put on people don't go into the brain. It doesn't change your attitudes, it doesn't change your behavior, and we go nowhere. And then scientists believe it helps to shout even louder. Maybe more charts and more facts. Or if you reduce the uncertainty, or you increase the certainty of your IPCC statement. So now it's virtually certain that we have anthropogenic climate change. Are you agree? Are you not changing your car?
Well, I actually don't have a car, so I don't have to bother about climate change. But again, so if this is my brain, it's well, almost completely full. I guess so. More facts doesn't help. What does help? Well, how do we get more stuff into or is it not facts that we need?
Yeah. So I think we maybe should do an overview of the different ways that the brain responds, because then it's easier to understand how actually we can make room for it. So the first thing is that climate is a very distant, abstract thing in at least 4 different ways. First, it is typically about the year 2050 or 2100. So where is 2050 in your calendar?
Well, it's a bit in the back.
A bit in the back.
By my retirement plan. So it's in there, but it's way. It's
so far away in time, right?
Yeah.
And then when you hear about global warming, you typically think about glaciers melting, or Arctic ice, or maybe hurricanes in Florida or wherever, and typically they tend to be far away from me in space. Third, if I do something, I will have very little impact on it, so it's distant from me in terms of my influence. So it's outside my scope of influence. And fourth, it hits typically poor people or other people, not me and my family, so it's socially distant. And we know from a lot of psychological research that the closer I perceive the person suffering is to me socially, the more empathy I will have. So in terms of time, space, influence, and impact, climate is abstract and very distant from me. So we call that psychological distancing. Of course, climate is very near. It's just here. It's in this room. The air you just breathe there has been changed.
Yeah, with all these brown, or not brown, but dangerous gas.
Molecules, if you wanted to go back to that. So that's a distance barrier. But I don't know, should we do all of them, or what do you want?
No, I think, well, I just want to respond to, or react to something you said. You said they're social distant. I mean, not all people are rich. So some people are poor, and it's actually affecting them. But those are not the people maybe who are changing the climate.
Yes, so you're right in terms of the ones who are creating the most of global warming are the ones who feel the less impact of it. And not just that, if you do correlations between CO2 footprint, so what is the average CO2 footprint of a country, and then measure how concerned are they. How concerned are you about climate change? Or I want to scale to 1 to 10. You don't have to answer right now.
10.
10, okay. You're that kind of guy. Now we know who he is.
I don't even have a car.
And no car, and I'm sure you're anti-guns, and you're then anti, what do you call it? You're, I lost that. You're anti-guns and pro-abortion. That was my thing. Because what they find in psychological research is that if you ask Americans, for instance, if they are pro or against guns, then you have a 90% chance of guessing their opinion and concern level on the climate change.
Sure. So, yeah.
So this goes back to how the brain is configured, and we may get there.
Yeah.
But the last point I want to make was that in countries where there's a high CO2 footprint, then the concern is lower. And in countries that have a very low CO2 footprint per person, the concern for climate change is much higher. Very paradoxical, huh? Or may it be that we feel a little bit bad about ourselves, so we don't want to really get into that uncomfortable responsibility and concern.
So, okay, so, yeah, this is a bit gloomy, though. We have, it's far away, and we deny it, and learning facts won't help us, or help anyone. Well, I may be concerned, but I'm obviously not doing enough. So what can we do?
Yeah. Another barrier we have to solve before we get to the solution is the over-reliance on fear and guilt and doom when you communicate climate or issues.
Okay.
So already 40 years ago, when Jim Hansen broke the news about global warming in the New York Senate in 1988, then the whole field exploded, and it was a new threat. It was the first time people really heard about climate change, how threatening it is, and it was a very warm summer, so a lot of people felt that this was, wow. And then the message started to repeat itself. So every year, climate scientists would come with alarm because they saw ever more alarming issues. But the problem is that the human brain has a limit to how much apocalypse and doom and disasters we're able to take in. So we get 3 types of responses. The first is that we habituate. It's very usual in psychology. It's also, I think it was mentioned something about addiction here earlier. So if I drink something, I get an effect the first time, but if I drink every day, the effect is less and less. So you have to keep pouring more on to get the same response. So after habituation, we have avoidance behaviors, which is that if you keep being very concerned about climate and you talk about it all the time and you make me feel bad, next time I will go and speak with somebody else.
Okay.
So I will avoid you because you give me a bad vibe.
Okay.
And maybe I will not invite you to my next party because he's a party pooper. We were having a lot of fun and then this guy comes. Always is about the climate and always is about bad.
Right.
So we avoid those kind of people and you avoid that kind of news. And the third thing is that we eventually end up with stereotypes. So I will project things on you. Oh, these climate hysterics, they are just, you know, the kind of end of the world, the end is nigh types. And yeah, as they say in the US, goddamn tree huggers.
Okay, so it's...
so this way, the fear and the threat messages build up a resistance in the brain. So we feel distant, and if it comes near, it's threatful. And thirdly, it's on the dissonance side, which means that if I now acknowledge that global warming is here, we saw it this summer with all the wildfires, we saw it with the recent floods in Pakistan, etc. So I know maybe I should eat less meat, fly a bit less, and maybe save on the power or drive my car a little bit less. But then I have family. I have my son. He studies somewhere, and I have to fly to see him. And I have, a grandmother. She gives me Swedish meatballs, and you can't say no to Swedish meatballs, can you?
No.
So I'm forced into living a high-carbon lifestyle, while I know I should have a low. And this is called the dissonance barrier because it makes me feel guilty, and then I want to self-justify myself. So now we have distance, doom, and dissonance. And these 3 are maybe the most difficult to treat. And since you asked me, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
Then we'll get to the solutions. So the first thing about distance is that if you make something social, then the distance disappears. So from an evolutionary psychology point of view, the human brain is a social flock type of scanning device. I always know the status of myself relative to others. I'm looking for who likes me, who does not like me, and who do I want to be like, who can I learn from? And if we can then use that power of the brain to be fantastically socially complex and related, to talk about climate in a kind of positive way or in a way that makes me feel more accepted, more liked, then it really triggers deep motivation in the brain. So for instance, if you have a house and then you put solar panels on it, or the other way around, if your neighbor puts solar panels on their roof, and now the power price goes up, and you see your neighbor goes like this, suddenly, I want them too.
Okay.
And
so, I mean, jealousy seems like a...
Sorry?
Is jealousy sort of a key then?
Jealousy, envy,
like is it social
status, competition, these things go deep in the human brain. Rational people may not like it, but a lot part of the brain is actually that. Any teacher who studies the dynamics of his class will know that I'm telling the truth.
Okay, so that's distance, right? So how do we solve doom? I guess you're saying these things that we shouldn't talk about this in sort of this apocalyptic way, not because the threat isn't real, but because it doesn't work, right?
Yeah, correct.
So what works when it comes to doom?
Well, research shows that people who feel fear and guilt become more passive. So what we want is to engage people. So if we can get them out of fear and guilt, but both those emotions can be very powerful drivers if you are able to channel them. So you can make them kind of express into something that is constructive and not internally destructive, eating yourself up in fear or guilt, rather than taking that energy out and doing something. So the whole thing is to have a balance. And some research into something called the positivity ratio is that you should be very clear about the threat, it is an existential threat, and give at least 3 cool things you can do. So it may be better for your health to go biking rather than sitting stuck in a car. It may also be good for your company in terms of risk management or de-risking for floods, or if the energy price goes up and you have insulated, then your risk of going broke because of high power prices is reduced. And thirdly, we have opportunity. So a mix of health benefits, risk management. So we deal with the fear by making people more secure, selling trust and security, and finally, all the incredible cool things we can do that are also climate friendly. Anything from yoga classes to doing coaching or learning or research or music or anything that's not very materially consumptive.
So alleviating climate change is not only about risk aversion, it's about creating opportunities.
Yeah, I think we need to trigger the lust center in the brain, and that is something which I want that. I want to join that.
Does that also help with the dissonance part then, that we don't feel the dissonance so much if we all do the things that we want to do and they're good?
Yeah, it does. These are not, clinically separate. These are related. So you can be both social and you can do things that are positive together with others. In addition, the bad news is that humans are not very thoughtful when we go through our everyday lives. We are stressed, we are tired, and we go by habit. So we don't think much, and if I have to check like 10 different air conditioners or 10 different bikes or whatever, washing machines to see which one is the most climate-friendly one, then I go,
it's too much.
Too much. So we need to rearrange the choice architecture so that if we don't think much, if we have a headache that day and I'm tired, then suddenly we come out with the best dish. Like we had over here at lunch, lots of beautiful vegetarian options, plant-based options, and it was easy to get. So in that way, if we can do that in terms of food and energy and mobility and the way we live in our buildings, then suddenly we can help people shift gradually towards easy and convenient behaviors, and then the dissonance goes away, because now I am doing something. It's easier to go biking than to sit in a traffic jam. It's easier to eat a delicious plant-based thing than go all the way down to McDonald's to get a Big Mac, and so you go.
Yeah, it's several meters away, the McDonald's.
Yeah. So now we did social, supportive framings, and simple solutions.
Yeah.
It's what they call brain-friendly solutions.
Yeah, that's. It seems like we're sort of getting. That seems like we're trying. The idea is to get things closer to us rather than having the distance that you started with.
Yeah.
I guess. I think actually we have maybe time for one question before we move into the breakout sessions. Do you have one?
We have one interesting here about gender differences. A teacher is curious, wondering, is there a gender difference in how we think and act about the climate?
Lots of cool research in climate psychology. When I started to write that book you mentioned, there were maybe 300 or 400 articles, but that's now 9 or 10 years ago, so now there may be a few thousand. It's going boom, exponential growth in climate psychology.
Yeah, so
and a lot of it relates to gender. So who do you think are the most skeptical and the least concerned segment in the world?
My guess is men.
People like me, white males over 50.
Yeah, an applause for white males over 50. That's
and then I have one more answer to that question. It also goes a little bit in terms of language. Actually, it seems that English-speaking languages have a much higher skepticism and lower concern than those who speak other languages than English. So some people are considering, what is this strange correlation between speaking English and being skeptical? And some people suggest Murdoch. But you know, we don't have to go down that route. But the positive thing I want to say in terms of gender is that who are the most effective climate communicators? And the answer seems to be, based on some studies, it is teenage girls. Because when the teenage girl comes home and takes her daddy for real over dinner, he has nowhere to fly. So the most effective change-driving climate communicators are your, shall we say, constituents, or your set of social network. Yeah.
What language does she speak?
What language is
the daughter?
If English is bad, what language would be best?
Oh.
Maybe we can have a vote later. Which language is best. You can think about that question, and maybe we'll take it up in the next session. Because I think we have to move on now to the breakout sessions, right?
That's right.
Well, now I am so happy to sit here next to our final guest today, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, social reformer, children's rights activist, and a person who surely puts words into action. You are so very welcome, Kailash Satyarthi.
My pleasure, Karen.
In 2014, you and your co-laureate, Malala Yousafzai, received the Nobel Peace Prize for your struggle against the suppression of children and young people and for the right of all children to education. And you have persistently worked for social reforms and campaigned against child labor for decades now. You and your team have liberated more than 100,000 children from child labor, slavery, and trafficking. But I'm thinking everything begins somewhere. And you've told, I've heard you talk about how you, as a little boy, starting school in the town Vidisha in India, your hometown, that you noticed another little boy outside the schoolyard, outside the school system, that was polishing shoes in the street. Can you tell us what that experience did for you?
Thank you. First of all, before answering your question, I will tell you that whenever I'm with the teachers, educators, anywhere in the world, I feel at home. The reason was that I started my career as a teacher, as a professor in electrical engineering in Bhopal University. So that was my first profession. Everybody remembers the first profession, so me. So it was the first day of my schooling, Karen. I was 5.5 years old. And I was told at home that every child is supposed to go to school at this age. So when I was entering in my school, I saw a cobbler boy right at the doorstep. He was looking at us with empty eyes, whether we are going to give him some job of shoe shining, but all of us were wearing new shoes, polished shoes. So I stood for a while and felt uneasy. And the first question came to my mind, that why he's sitting here. So when I went in my class, I asked the first question in my life to my teacher, "Sir, why a child is sitting outside the school gate and not with rest of us in the classroom? He looked surprisingly, but he said, calm down, it's not uncommon. Poor children have to work and help their families. He said, make new friends and so on. This is your first day. Be familiar with the school. So I sat down, but I felt uneasy the whole day. I was still thinking of that boy because I carried his miserable eyes and his helplessness with me in my classroom. So when I went out in the afternoon, the boy was still sitting in the open sky under the Indian heat, Indian sun, maybe 45 degrees Celsius or so. So every morning and afternoon I saw the boy. In the meantime, I asked my mother, my relatives, friends, the same question, and the answer was more or less similar. Then one day when I was coming back from the school, I asked directly to this boy and his father, who was sitting alongside. Boy was shy. He was my age, almost. But the father stood up with folded hands. And I didn't know much about this kind of social apartheid, the caste system, so deep-rooted caste hierarchy. So standing with folded hands, he said, sir, I never thought about it. My father, my grandfather, my ancestors started working since they were children, and so is my son. Then he put his eyes down with utter helplessness. And he said, sir, you guys are born to go to school, to study, but we are born to work. I could not understand, and out of anger and pain, I started crying, and I went back home. But that day has given me the first lesson of my life, that whatever the wise people, parents, and sometimes teachers say, it may be the age-old complacency, the age-old mindset, the age-old teachings and learnings. So let us begin with the question. My eyes were filled with the question. I started seeing the world with that perspective, with that eye. And then I saw many children were working here and there. And this question had become deeper, and that was the first spark which has led to me in giving up my career. My parents wanted to make me an engineer. That was my father's dream. My father was a police constable, but he passed away when I was young, so my widow mother has to spend a lot of money and has to sell her ornaments and everything for my higher studies in engineering. But I could never forget that boy. And I still think the same question, why the children are born to work? Why they are forced to work and be enslaved at the cost of their childhood, their freedom, their education, their dreams, their aspirations. This is unacceptable. Slavery and civilization cannot go in hand. All of you are sitting here because of two reasons. Of course, you have worked hard, you have studied hard, you got good jobs, your parents were great, your teachers were great, your countries were great. But the two things which I always say, one is freedom. You were free to go to school. You were free to think. You were free to dream. What else could be the bigger crime than taking away, robbing of the dreams of our children in the world? And you know that 260 million children have to be in school today, in primary and secondary classes. They are not. Why? This is the question I always ask to myself, and that was my leading light, that was my first spark. Thank you.
And this anger that you mention, a driving force, I can imagine, as I mentioned, puts words into action because you acted as little as you were. You acted and you collected books and you gave to kids who couldn't afford them, and the acting continued, the action continued. You started working with the liberating enslaved people from the early 80s. If you would compare the world that you entered in then, professionally, in the early 80s, to the world now when it comes to trafficking and child labor, what are the differences?
Much difference, definitely. I'm very optimistic. When I started my fight against child slavery and child labor, it was a serious problem, though it was a non-issue in the eyes of people. There was no political discourse, there was no social discourse. People accepted it as a norm that poor children are working. Nothing is absurd in it. So that was common practice. As you know, that in case of gender discrimination, which has been there for years and years and centuries for centuries, even it is still existing. I cannot say, nobody can say that we have won this battle, that is still on. But for years, the women were treated as the second-grade citizens, second-grade people in the families and society. That was even worse in case of children. So it was very challenging because that fight was against the mindset, the complacency. I didn't know how to do because nobody was practically freeing children or working anywhere in the world, and there was no written document to learn or nothing. In most countries, there was no law, and that was quite difficult. So I started a magazine to sensitize and educate the people, believing that childhood should not be compromised. Freedom cannot be negotiated and compromised. So I started a magazine, and one day, a frail person knocked on my door whose daughter was born and grew up in slavery in India, in a place called Sirhind in Punjab. And this 15-year-old daughter, Sabo, was about to be sold to a brothel. She has not seen the outside world since she was born, and many more children who were born there, because the parents were enslaved. So he came with expectation that I can publish his story, perhaps government people and others will see and then act. But Karen and friends, when I was writing this story as the editor of this magazine, after giving up my engineering career, I started thinking that if she was my sister or my daughter, what would I do? Would I still write the things and wait that somebody should come and help? No. I will hold the whole world upside down. I will do every possible thing to free my sister. I was 25, 26-year-old. That was in early 1981, in the month of March. I gave up my pen and I decided I am going to free that girl. And I told this man, his name was Vasal Khan. So I said, Vasal, I am going to free your daughter. He said, no, it's not possible. But then I asked my wife, Sumedha, who is sitting here, and requested her to give her wedding ornament so that I can organize the logistics like a truck, because there were 36 children, women and men enslaved there. And it was not in Delhi, it was far, far from Delhi. So somehow we went there, we were beaten up, we were pushed back. I came with torn clothes and without shoes and so on, but did not give up. I never believed in giving up, because the solution of every problem is born in the womb of problem itself. One has to be resilient, one has to be courageous, one has to have strategic. So when I came back, I met a friend of mine, lawyer, and knocked on the door of the High Court. And with the help of High Court, we were able to free this beautiful sister of mine, Sabo, and 36 children, women and men. And that was the moment of truth for me. Because when the tears rolled down on the faces of those mothers who can never believe that this day will happen in their life, and the children were jumping on the streets after freedom, I felt that this is the glimpse of God. If God is not there on the faces of those children and those mothers, where is the God? I don't know who has found the God, but since then, I could see the glimpse of God's in more than 100,000 times in my life. And since then, the things have changed. Child labor became an issue in India. I never believed in borders in my lifetime, so I started working in Nepal, which was easier. Then I took a higher challenge, perhaps the biggest challenge, to work in Pakistan. I started working in Pakistan, so Pakistani government charged that I am Indian spy. Indians started telling me, blaming me that he is a Pakistani spy. It was good to be a spy of both the countries. At least there is someone who can be spying for India and Pakistan.
Double spy. Yeah.
So double spy for two countries. But I started working in many more countries in South Asia and then globally. And since then, we have seen that child labor, child slavery is an issue which cannot be ignored, neither by the governments, nor by the companies and corporates and the society. That has become an issue in the world. And my biggest and humblest contribution to humankind, or perhaps giving back to the humankind what I got in all my life, is to make the most miserable, the most vulnerable, soundless, voiceless, identityless children visible. They are visible today. Nobody can ignore my children of the world. Nobody can ignore. That was my biggest contribution. But of course, we brought about policy changes. When there was no international law against child slavery, trafficking, child prostitution, etc., we started and launched a global march against child labor, which went across 103 countries, started from 3 corners of the world, from Manila, from Sao Paulo, and from Cape Town. All these 3 marches merged together. And that was a crazy idea for an ordinary person like me to march with the survivors and with the children, going from one to another country physically, and covered 80,000 kilometers distance, Karen, that is double than the periphery of the earth. In those 103 countries, we were able to build a strong social movement and political movement. Politicians joined us. 71 presidents and prime ministers joined in different places. It had become an issue. And when we reached in Geneva, we have given a special status to address the General Assembly of International Labour Organization, what they call the annual convention. So in that convention, my children and I were there, and we said that world is not so poor. That cannot take away the tools and guns from the tiny hands and replace them with books and pencils and toys. That was not a big deal. It's the question. The poverty is the poverty of priorities, poverty of honesty, the poverty of love and compassion. That was the problem. Wealth was not the problem. Money was not the problem. It's still not the problem. So I tell you that that day when the children and I raised this voice, most of the leaders sitting, the government leaders, they were in tears. They didn't have moral courage. And I tell you, I underline here, that was not me. It was because of the purest and the most compelling voice of survivors, the children who have been enslaved. Some of the former child prostitutes, some of the former child soldiers, they stood on the dais and they said that we want education. And within a year, a new international law has been enacted, and now this has become the only, I underline, only ILO convention which has been universally ratified. All countries have ratified in their parliaments. And that time the number of child laborers was 250 million, but in 2026 it has come down to 152 million. Almost 100 million lesser number of children existed in the world that time. So change is not only possible, it is inevitable. Freedom wins, hope wins, truth wins. Freedom will prevail, always prevail over slavery. It's a matter of time. You are the champions, you are the carriers of that message. Education is liberator, education is emancipator, education is enabler, education is equalizer, education is empathizer, and you are the drivers. You are the ambassadors of education. So I needless to say all these things to you. You know much better than me. You feel and you act. So I see that be the voice of the most marginalized children of the world who are not able to come to school because they are not free, because they are not given the opportunity. You should be the voice of those 260 million children of the world. And I always say that educators are like majestics. When I was teaching in the university, I felt like that. Majestic. Prepare to sacrifice yourself. Prepare to burn yourself to light a candle. And that candle, 1 candle, 2 candles, 200 candles, they will become 2 million candles. But one has to courage, a teacher has the courage to be the majestic, to ignite the first candle. You are the sculptor who takes away the unnecessary mass from the stone and make a beautiful idol, make a beautiful sculpture. You can get a pencil in your hand and paper in your hand and draw something. It becomes an art piece. So you are change makers, my dear sisters and brothers.
Well, there is absolutely nothing to add to that. So, Kailash Satyarthi, thank you so much for joining us. A warm hand. Thank you.
Should I tell the story? Gale? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, and the Nobel Prize.
Child slavery, all of us? Raise your hands then. Raise your hands. I am not simply a Nobel laureate or a teacher or a speaker or someone. I am one of you. So raise your hands if you wanted to become the voice of those children who are not in school. Do you want to become? Say loudly. I did not say that raise your one hand. I said raise your hands. Thank you so much.
Well, again, nothing to add to that. We are coming to an end, and next week will be a tremendously exciting week where the Nobel Prizes of 2022 will be announced. Stay tuned, follow us on our social channels and see what happens. I think it will be a thrill, as always. And on the Nobel Prize Museum's website, you will find the Nobel Prize lessons, only 24 hours after each announcement. So if you want to work in the classroom on the newest prizes the day after, there will be ready-to-use material to do that. So Alfred Nobel, he writes in his testament that those shall be awarded who have done something for the benefit of humankind. That is our leading star. Working for a sustainable future
so that people can live in a sustainable presence is not only beneficial to humankind, it is necessary. And we want to thank all our amazing guests today for their sharpness, their insight, their compassion, and their visions. And from the Nobel Prize Museum, we also would like to thank you. As many speakers have said today, change is possible. Well, listen to Kailash Satyarthi, for example.